Your heart has just stopped, not as a manner of speaking. Right now, inside the little world of this thought experiment, the last squeeze of the muscle has already happened. The valves have fallen shut. Nothing is moving. The blood that was on its way up to your brain a heartbeat ago has just come to rest the way traffic comes to rest when the light turns red and nobody ever arrives to turn it green again. And a clock has started. You cannot see it. You cannot feel it. But it is running. In about 4 seconds roughly, the lights in your head go out. Not slowly, not gently like a room at bedtime with somebody easing the dimmer down, more like a whole city block when the power station trips. One moment there is a warm hum of 100 billion little conversations, and the next moment there is a hush, because every one of those conversations was being paid for in energy by the second, and the payments have stopped. Now I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 4 seconds. That is how long the most complicated object we have ever found in the universe can keep the show running on its own savings once the supply is cut. 4 seconds. You could not boil an egg in that. You could barely tie your shoe. And in that little window, the thing you have spent your whole life being, the thing that is reading along with me at this exact instant, begins to slip. Here is why it is so fast, and it is worth getting this right, because the whole mystery hangs on it. Your brain is not like a battery-powered toy that runs down slowly. Your brain is more like a fire. A fire does not store its heat. A fire needs fuel arriving right now and air arriving right now, and if you take those away, the fire does not fade over an afternoon. It goes out almost as fast as you can pour water on it. Your neurons are little fires of a chemical kind. Every second, they burn a molecule you can think of as the body's pocket change, the currency it spends to do anything at all, and they burn it about as fast as the blood delivers it. There is almost no savings account. There is barely a purse. When the delivery stops, the purse is empty in a few breaths, except now there are no breaths. So the machinery that holds up your awareness, that keeps the whole tower of you standing, runs out of coins in seconds, and the tower begins to lean. And then, within something like 10 to 30 seconds, if you were to stick little wires on the scalp and watch the electrical weather of the brain, the whole storm goes quiet. The trace that was jumping and dancing lies down and goes flat, flat like a calm sea with no wind, flat like a struck drum that has stopped ringing. In the language of the hospital, the brain has gone silent. That is where the textbook likes to put a period at the end of the sentence. The heart stops. The brain starves. The electricity dies. You die. Case closed. Sign the paper. Go home. And for a very long time, that was the whole story, and it seemed like a perfectly good story, because it had no loose ends sticking out that anybody could see. Now I have to be honest with you, the way one honest person is with another late at night. I do not fully trust stories with no loose ends. Nature is not tidy. Nature almost never closes a case that cleanly. Whenever somebody tells me a thing is completely finished and understood and there is nothing more to look at, I get a little itch at the back of my neck, because usually it means nobody has looked hard enough yet. And in this case, somebody finally did look harder. And what they found does not fit the tidy story at all. Let me tell you what they found, and I am going to tell it to you cold, without dressing it up, because the plain fact is stranger than anything I could add to it. In recent years, at a laboratory at the University of Michigan, some scientists were watching the brains of people who were dying. These were patients in a coma, patients who could not be saved, and with the family's blessing, the machine that was breathing for them was removed. So the heart stopped. And by every rule in the old story, the brain should have simply gone dark and stayed dark, the flat sea, the silent drum, nothing more to see. That is not what the wires showed. In the seconds after the heart quit, in some of these patients, the brain did not go quieter. It got louder. Not a little louder. In one measure of the fastest, most delicate electrical rhythms the brain can make, the kind of rhythm that ordinarily shows up when a person is wide awake and vividly aware and putting the world together into a single seamless experience, the activity did not fade towards zero. It leapt. It climbed to something like 392 times its ordinary level. Not 392%. 392 times. I want you to feel how upside down that is. Picture a great concert hall. The power to the building has just been cut. Every rule you know says the music should die, the lights should die, the whole place should sink into dark and quiet. And instead, for a few seconds, in the moment after the power fails, the orchestra plays the loudest, fastest, most intricate passage of the entire evening. Music of a kind you only hear when everyone in the hall is fully, achingly awake. That is roughly what these instruments recorded coming out of a brain whose heart had already stopped. It did not happen to every patient. Out of 4 whose dying brains were watched this closely, 2 of them did this astonishing thing and 2 did not. So it is not a law, not yet, not something that happens to everyone like clockwork. But it happened. It was real. It was measured. It is sitting there in the record, and it does not care whether it fits our tidy story or not. And there is one more detail, and this is the detail that turned a curiosity into a genuine puzzle for me. The kind of puzzle you cannot put down. This surge of fast rhythm did not come from just anywhere in the brain. It was not smeared evenly across the whole organ like the last flicker of a dying bulb. It was concentrated. It gathered itself in one particular neighborhood of the cortex, back and to the side at the place where 3 of the brain's great territories come together and shake hands. And that particular neighborhood is not a random one. It happens to be one of the same regions that light up when a person feels themselves floating out of their own body, and when a person dreams, the brain's own workshop for building the sense of where you are and whether you are inside your skin at all. So here is the case as it stands on the table in front of us. A brain with no blood, no oxygen, no more coins in its purse. A brain that by all the old rules should be a cold and silent instrument, instead throws out a burst of exactly the kind of electrical music we associate with being intensely consciously awake. And it throws it out from exactly the part of itself that handles the feeling of leaving the body, in the seconds after death has, by the old definition, already begun. Now, what in the world do we do with that? Because there are only a few honest possibilities, and we are going to have to walk down each one and see where it leads, slowly, patiently, turning over every stone. Maybe it is nothing. Maybe it is just the machinery clattering as it falls apart, a last meaningless spasm, sound and fury signifying an engine seizing up, and we are fooling ourselves by seeing a ghost in the smoke. That is possible. We will take that idea seriously, because it might be right, and a good investigator never falls in love with the exciting answer. Or maybe it is something. Maybe in those strange seconds there is a somebody still home. Maybe the surge is not the noise of a machine breaking, but the signature of an experience, a real experience, happening to a real person at the one moment none of us can ever report back from. And if that is true, then the border we call death is not a wall at all. It is a doorway, and something is still standing in it, looking back at us for just a little while longer than we ever imagined. I do not know which of those it is. I want to say that plainly right at the start, because I am going to be your partner in this, not your preacher. We are going to work it out together, the way you work out any good mystery, by gathering the clues one at a time, by being suspicious of the ones that are too convenient, by chasing the false trails all the way to their dead ends so we know they are dead ends, and by letting the physics, the actual physics, tell us what is truly allowed and what is not. And the physics has a great deal to say about this, more than you would think. It has something to say about information and whether it can ever really be destroyed. It has something to say about the smallest machinery inside your cells and whether there is a place down there where the strange rules of the quantum world could be hiding. It has something to say about heat and order and the one direction that time is allowed to flow. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can ask what happens to you when the clock runs out, we have to be very sure about something much more basic. We have to be sure about what was happening in those 4 seconds, what exactly falls apart, and in what order when the coins run out and the fires begin to go dark. So let us go back to the very first instant, back to the crime scene itself, back to the moment the heart falls still, and let us watch, very carefully, in slow motion, what happens next. Picture the heart as a pump in the basement of a very old house. For a whole lifetime it has never once stopped. Not while you slept, Not while you ran, not while you sat perfectly still and thought you were doing nothing at all. And now, for whatever reason, it stops. The pump falls quiet. And upstairs, in the topmost room of the house, in the brain, nothing seems to happen at first. That is the strange thing about this crime. For the first second or two, there is no alarm. The lights are still on. The tenant is still home. Everything looks exactly as it did. So let us slow the film down until each second stretches out like an afternoon. And let us look at what the brain is actually made of. Because you cannot understand how it fails until you understand the trick it was doing all along. Every cell in your brain is, in a small quiet way, a battery. I want you to sit with that, because it is lovely and it is true. Around the outside of each neuron there is a thin skin, a membrane, and that membrane keeps two different kinds of water apart. On the inside, the cell hoards a certain amount of potassium and keeps sodium out. On the outside, it is the reverse. Plenty of sodium, less potassium. Salt on one side, a different salt on the other. And because these are charged particles, because they carry a little electricity with them, keeping them separated builds up a voltage across that skin. A tiny difference in electrical pressure, like water held behind a low wall. Every one of your billions of neurons sits there humming with this stored voltage, ready, cocked, waiting to fire. Nature does not give you that separation for free. Left alone, salt wants to mix. If you put a drop of ink in a glass of water and walk away, you come back to find it spread evenly through the whole glass, never once gathered back into a drop. Things spread out. Differences smooth over. That is simply the way of the world, and we will come back to that way of the world again and again before this night is over, because it turns out to be the deepest character in the whole story. For now, just hold on to the picture. The cell is fighting that spreading. It is holding the ink in one corner of the glass by sheer effort. And how does it do the holding? With a little machine built into the membrane. A pump. Millions of them actually, studded all over the surface of every cell. Each pump grabs sodium that has leaked in and shoves it back out, and grabs potassium and drags it back in, against their will, uphill, all day and all night. It is bailing a boat that is always very slowly leaking. And to run this pump, to do this endless bailing, the cell needs energy, and it pays for that energy in a single currency. We called them coins earlier, and I am going to keep calling them that, because it is honest. The coin is a molecule, and its job is to carry a little packet of usable energy from where the food was burned to wherever the work needs doing. The pump takes a coin, spends it, throws sodium overboard, and reaches for the next coin. Here is the fact that governs everything that follows. The brain keeps almost no coins in savings. It lives hand to mouth. It burns through its little pocket of ready energy in a matter of a minute or two, and the only reason it never runs dry is that fresh coins are being minted every single second, from sugar and from oxygen, both of which arrive by one delivery surface and one only. The blood. The heartbeat is the delivery truck, and the truck has just stopped in the driveway. So now the film rolls forward, one slow second at a time. For the first few seconds, the brain spends the coins already in its pocket. The pumps keep bailing. The batteries stay charged. You are still awake, still yourself, still, as far as you can tell, perfectly fine. But the mint has gone dark. No new coins are coming, and a purse that is not being refilled empties faster than you would ever guess. Somewhere between 4 seconds and 20 seconds after the pump in the basement falls silent, the lights go out upstairs. Consciousness leaves. Not slowly, not with a long fade. It winks out, the way a room goes dark when the switch is thrown, because the electrical chatter that holds the thought together simply cannot be paid for anymore. And if you were watching the electrical activity of that brain on a machine, watching those living rhythms scribble across a page, you would see them shrink and settle and go flat within 10 seconds to 30 seconds. Flat, a quiet line where a moment ago there was a storm. Most people would stop the investigation right there. The line went flat. Case closed, they would say. The tenant has left the building. We will find out later, much later, that the flat line is not the end of the story at all, that something extraordinary is still coming, but I am getting ahead of myself and I promised we would go slowly. So keep watching. Because underneath that flat, quiet line, down at the level of the single cell, the crime is only just beginning, and it unfolds with a terrible orderliness. The coins run out completely, and the moment they do, the pumps stop. They have nothing left to spend. The bailing ends. And now the ink begins to spread. Sodium, which the cell worked so hard all its life to keep outside, starts leaking in, and there is no pump to throw it back. Wherever salt goes, water follows, because water always tries to even out the saltiness on both sides of a skin. So water flows in after the sodium, and the cell begins to swell. It puffs up like a sponge dropped in a bucket. Doctors have a name for this swelling, a cold clinical name, but I would rather you just see it a living cell bloating because the little machine that kept it lean has run out of coins. This swelling happens everywhere at once, in cell after cell, and the pressure of all that swelling is itself part of the injury. As the batteries drain, the potassium that was hoarded inside comes pouring out through the failing membrane. And out there, on the outside, that flood of potassium does something almost contagious. It nudges the neighboring cells toward the edge, tips them over so that their batteries dump too, and their potassium spills, which tips the next ones, and the next. What begins in one small patch becomes a wave, a slow, silent wave of electrical collapse that rolls across the surface of the brain, across that folded gray outer rind where so much of your thinking lies, spreading out from where it started like a ripple moving across the top of a still pond. It travels through the cortex within about 2 minutes of the blood supply failing. Scientists who study this wave call it a spreading depolarization, which is just a long way of saying the wall came down, and once it starts to come down in one place, it keeps coming down all along the line. And the wave is the herald of something worse. As the cells lose their grip, gates in their membranes that are supposed to open only for an instant and only on command swing wide and stick open. Through these gates rushes calcium, a messenger the cell normally keeps on the tightest possible leash. Because calcium inside a cell is a signal for action, and too much of it, all at once uncontrolled, is a signal for demolition. The flooding calcium switches on the wrecking crews, the little scissors and shredders that a healthy cell keeps locked away, and they begin, quite indiscriminately, to take the machinery apart. There is one more actor, and it is a cruel one. Neurons talk to each other with chemical words, tiny puffs of messenger molecules squirted across the gaps between them. The most common word in the brain's whole vocabulary, the one that means go, that means fire, is a molecule called glutamate. In life, it is released in the smallest, most careful amounts and mopped up again almost instantly. But a dying, swollen, calcium-flooded neuron dumps its entire store of glutamate at once, and there is no energy left to mop it up. So the go signal screams out, unstoppable, into the spaces between the cells, and it lands on the neighbors and forces their gates open too. Forces more calcium in, more demolition, more glutamate spilled, on, a shout that makes everything it touches shout in turn. This self-feeding storm has a name as well. It is called excitotoxicity, which is a way of saying the cells are being excited to death, driven so hard by their own signaling that they tear themselves apart. Notice the order of it, because the order matters and we will need it later. First the coins run out, then the pumps stop, then the batteries drain, and the lights go out and the line goes flat. Then the cells swell, the potassium floods, the wave of collapse rolls across the cortex. Then the gates stick open, the calcium pours in, the glutamate screams, and the demolition begins in earnest. It is not one event. It is a cascade, a sequence, each step knocking over the next, like a long row of standing dominoes that only needed the first small push, and the first small push was simply the truck failing to arrive. And through all of this, a clock is running. Because for a little while, a surprisingly generous little while, none of this is final. The cascade has begun, but it has not yet crossed the line past which there is no coming back. Push the coins back into the purse soon enough, get the delivery truck moving again, and the pumps start bailing, the walls go back up, the storm quiets. Wait too long, and it becomes a demolition that no rescue can undo. Where exactly that line sits, and what it really means to cross it, is the next thing we have to pin down, because the whole mystery turns on it. So let me put on the coat of the coroner for a moment, because that is who wrote the official answer to our mystery, and it is a tidy answer, and for a very long time nobody had any reason to doubt it. The coroner says this: the heart stops, the blood stops. The brain, which was drinking oxygen and sugar greedily every second of your life, is suddenly handed nothing. And within something like 10 to 30 seconds, the electrical chatter you could have picked up on a machine at the scalp goes quiet. The pens that were scribbling their restless little mountains across the paper settle down into a flat line. That flat line is the thing everyone pictures. That is the sound the machine makes in every hospital room you have ever imagined. And the coroner says, there it is, that is the moment the lights went out. That is when the person stopped being present in the world. Then the coroner turns the page and tells you how long you have. Because the flat line is not the same thing as the ending. The flat line is the brain going silent. But silence is not the same as ruin. A concert hall goes silent between two pieces of music and nothing is broken. So the coroner draws a second line, a much more serious line further down the clock. In the most delicate cells, the ones with the highest appetite and the least patience, the true dismantling starts to become permanent somewhere around the 5-minute mark. And there is a window everyone in the business learns to respect, roughly 4 to 6 minutes, past which the odds turn very dark. Cross that window without the truck arriving, without the blood moving again, and even if the heart is coaxed back to beating, the mind it used to serve may not fully return. So the official verdict reads like a sentence with 2 clauses. The lights flicker off in seconds. The house itself begins to fall in minutes. And if you ask the coroner what happened to the person inside, the coroner would close the folder gently and say, the person was the electrical activity, and the electrical activity is gone, so the person is gone. Case closed. Sign here. Now I want to be fair to that answer, because it is not a foolish answer. It is built on a mountain of careful watching, and it saves lives, because it tells the people rushing in with their hands and their machines exactly how many seconds they are fighting against. If somebody you loved collapsed on a kitchen floor, you would want the coroner's clock in the room, and you would want everyone obeying it. So I am not here to sneer at it, but I have spent my life poking at tidy answers, not because they are wrong, but because tidy is a suspicious quality in nature. Nature is rarely tidy. Nature is fond of loopholes and side doors and little exceptions that turn out to be the whole story. So when someone hands me a case marked closed, I like to open it again in the quiet when no one is watching and just look at the edges of the thing to see if they really meet. And here is the first loose thread I want to pull, and it is a strange one, because it does not come from a seance or a story told by a frightened patient. It comes from a refrigerator. Consider what happens if you make the body cold. Take that same person, that same stopped heart, but chill the whole system down, bring it to somewhere around 32 to 34 degrees Celsius, well below the warm blood we walk around with. And the clock changes. The coroner's 4 to 6 minute stretches. The delicate cells that were supposed to be ruined on schedule sit there, waiting, tolerating the drought far longer than they had any right to. Cooling the brain slows the rate at which it burns through what it needs, and slowing that burn buys time, real time, minutes that were not supposed to exist. Sit with that for a second, because it is quietly enormous. If dying were a single instant, a switch thrown, a soul departing on a fixed schedule, then a cold room could not haggle with it. You cannot bribe a lightning strike to arrive a little later. But you can, apparently, bribe this. The line the coroner drew is not carved in stone. It is drawn in something more like wax, and the temperature of the room decides how fast the wax runs. Which means the ending we are chasing is not really an event at all. It is a process. It is a chemical fire working its way through a building, and like any fire, it burns faster when it is hot and slower when it is cold. And a process is a very different kind of suspect than an event. An event you can only witness. A process you can interrogate. A process has a rate, and a rate has causes, and causes can be leaned on. The whole thing suddenly looks less like a verdict and more like a negotiation. So already the closed case has a crack in it, and I have not even brought in a single strange report yet. All I did was make the body cold and watch the deadline move. But let me be honest about what that crack does and does not show. It does not show that the person is still in there past the deadline. It shows that the machinery of the brain can be preserved longer than the textbook says, that the demolition can be stalled. Whether the something we are really after, the awareness, the sense of being a someone looking out, whether that thing is stalled along with the machinery, or whether it left on schedule and only the empty rooms are being kept warm or kept cold, that the cold room cannot tell us. And that is the real question, isn't it? Not when the cells die, not when the machine goes flat, but when, if ever, the last flicker of experience actually winks out. Those might be the same moment. They might not be. The coroner assumed they were the same. That assumption is exactly the thing I want to keep my thumb on, because everything hangs on whether it is true. Here is what makes it so slippery. The flat line, that quiet on the machine, is our main witness, and our main witness may be nearsighted. When the pens settle down and the paper goes smooth, we say the brain is silent. But silent to whom? Silent to a machine listening from outside the skull, through bone and skin and fluid, catching only the loudest, most coordinated shouting of billions of cells singing together. A whole city could lose its stadium roar, its rush hour, its parades, and fall silent to a microphone up on a satellite, while down in the streets a great deal is still happening, quietly, in the dark, unheard from that height. So the flat line tells us the great public chorus has stopped. It does not all by itself tell us that every last conversation in every back room has ended. It tells us the brain has stopped shouting. It does not prove the brain has stopped whispering. And whether there is any whispering left, and whether any whisper could carry a passenger, an experience, a point of view, is precisely what we cannot read off that smooth flat line no matter how hard we squint at it. Now a careful person, and I hope you are becoming one as we go, will immediately raise a hand and say, wait. You are just inventing whispers because you want them to be there. And that is a fair and necessary objection, and I accept it fully. If the only reason to believe in whispers past the flat line were that the story is more comforting with them, I would throw them out without a second thought. Comfort is the worst possible reason to believe anything about nature. Nature does not care what would console us. So I am not going to ask you to believe in the whispers on faith. I am going to ask something much narrower. I am going to ask you to notice that the flat line, our tidy moment of death, is a measurement made from outside with an instrument of limited reach, and that the leap from the machine went quiet to the person is gone is a leap, an assumption, a bridge we built and then forgot we built. And once you see that it is a bridge and not solid ground, you have to ask whether anyone has ever gone and looked at what is actually happening underneath, down close, in the seconds right after the heart quits, with a better instrument than a nervous machine listening from the far side of the skull. Somebody did. And what they found was not silence. What they found, in the very seconds when the textbook promised the deepest quiet, was the opposite of quiet. It was a roar. Not the ordinary murmur of a living, thinking brain, but something wilder. Something that by every rule the coroner works with should not have been there at all. Before I take you into that room, though, I want us to be very clear about what we are even hunting for, because that turns out to be the hardest part of the whole business, harder than any refrigerator or any machine. We keep saying awareness, experience, the someone looking out, and we say those words as though we know what they point to. We do not. Nobody does. So before we can honestly ask whether it survives the flat line, we have to ask a much older and much more embarrassing question. One that has no settled answer even in a living, healthy, wide-awake brain sitting comfortably in a chair. We have to ask what the thing is in the first place. And that question is a strange one to hold, because the very instrument you would use to examine it is the instrument itself. Think of it this way. Suppose you wanted to weigh a scale using only that same scale. You put the scale on top of itself and it reads nothing sensible, because the very thing doing the measuring is the thing you are trying to measure. That is roughly our predicament with awareness. The only tool I have ever had for studying what it feels like to be me is the feeling of being me. I cannot step outside it. I cannot set it on a bench and shine a light on it from across the room. Everything I know about the world, every experiment I have ever trusted, every dial I have ever read, arrives inside this private glow first, and only then do I call it data. So when a scientist tells you he's going to explain consciousness, Watch him carefully, because he is standing inside the very room he claims to be describing from the outside. Now, plenty of clever people have tried to get around this by not asking what awareness feels like at all. They ask instead what awareness does. That is a much more honest place to plant your feet. You cannot open my skull and find a little glowing coal of experience, but you can measure what my brain is doing while I am aware, and you can measure what it does when I am not. When I am under deep anesthesia, or in a dreamless sleep, or knocked cold. And when you line those two situations up side by side, a difference jumps out at you. It is not in how much the brain burns, and it is not in any single spot lighting up. It is in a kind of rhythm. Let me tell you about that rhythm, because it is going to matter enormously later, and I want you to have it in your bones before we need it. The brain is full of little electrical drummers, billions of them, and left alone they would each tap out their own beat, a great disorganized clatter, like a stadium full of people clapping with no one in charge. But when you are awake and paying attention, something strange happens. Pockets of those drummers fall into step. They begin to clap together, very fast, dozens to more than 100 beats every single second. Physicists and the brain people call this fast synchronized clapping gamma activity. It sits up at the high end, somewhere from 25 to about 150 cycles a second. And here is the thing worth holding on to. Whenever you find a mammal that is clearly, richly aware, present, taking in the world, you tend to find this fast clapping riding on top of everything else. It is not proof of the private glow. Nobody has proof of the private glow. But it is about the best outward footprint of awareness we have ever found. People who study this for a living will tell you plainly that this gamma rhythm is one of the essential hallmarks of consciousness in mammals, and that includes you and me. So now you can feel the shape of the trap tightening. If fast synchronized clapping is the footprint of a mind that is home, and if death is the moment the mind goes out, then the story writes itself, does it not? The heart stops. The clapping should scatter. The drummers should fall back into their random clatter, and then, as the lights fail and the fuel runs dry, fall silent altogether. That is the tidy expectation. The footprint fades, and wherever the footprint goes, we assume the walker has gone too. There is another way people have tried to pin a number on the whole business, and I want to give it to you now gently, because we will come back and lean on it hard near the end. Instead of asking about clapping, this approach asks about wholeness. It says, look, a conscious mind is not just a lot of activity. A television full of snow has plenty of activity and knows nothing. What a mind has is a special kind of togetherness. Every part of the picture depends on every other part. The color of the sky in your visual field, the sound of my voice, the ache in your foot, the memory that just floated up, all of it is bound into a single unbroken experience that you cannot cut in half without destroying something. This school of thought, worked out carefully by a fellow named Giulio Tononi up at the University of Wisconsin, tries to put an actual quantity on that togetherness. They call it phi, never mind the symbol. Think of it as a measure of how much the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, how much information the system generates as one thing that its scattered pieces could never generate alone. And the lovely, terrible clarity of that idea is what it says about dying. As the brain fails, the parts stop being able to talk to one another. The bridges wash out, the togetherness comes apart. And phi, this measure of wholeness, slides down toward nothing. When it reaches zero, when no part can influence any other, there is by this account no longer a whole at all, and so there is no longer anyone there. That, if you like, is a death certificate written in the language of physics. Not the heart stopping, the wholeness dissolving. Phi going to zero. You will notice that both of these pictures, the fading of the fast clapping and the collapse of the wholeness, tell the same comfortable story. Consciousness is a pattern the living brain holds up against the dark, and when the brain fails, the pattern fails, and the room goes empty. Case closed. It is clean, it fits the textbook, and for a very long time no honest person had any strong reason to doubt it. But I have to be fair to you, and being fair means admitting how shaky the ground is under our feet even here, before any of the strange evidence arrives. Because there is a man who has spent his career at the bedside of people who died and came back, a physician named Sam Parnia, and he said something that I want you to turn over slowly in the quiet. He said death is not an absolute state. He said it is a process, and a process that could, at least in principle, be reversed. Now sit with how odd that is. We speak of death the way we speak of a switch, on and then off, alive and then not. Panya is telling us it is more like a fire going out or the tide going down, something that happens over an interval, with stages, with a middle. And if death has a middle, then there is a stretch of time in there, minutes long, where the person is neither clearly present nor clearly gone. And nobody had ever carefully asked what happens inside that stretch. Nobody had thought to point the instruments at the interval itself and simply watch. That is the gap. That is the unlit hallway in the middle of the house. For most of the history of medicine, we walked a patient up to the door of death, and we walked away, and whatever went on behind that door, we filled in with our tidy theory of fading rhythms and collapsing wholeness. We assumed. We did not look. And you already know, because I told you at the very start, that when somebody finally did point a careful instrument into that hallway and switch on the recording, what came back was not the silence the theory promised. It was something loud. Something that had no business being there. So let me finally take you into that room, and let me do it slowly, because the details are everything, and because I do not want you to take my word for any of it. I want you to see the machine and the trace and judge for yourself. The place is a hospital. The patients, 4 of them, are people in the deepest kind of coma, people who will not be coming back, people whose families have made the hardest decision there is, and with great care and permission the physicians have arranged to remove the support that has been breathing for them. This is not an experiment done to anyone. It is a moment of dying that was going to happen regardless, watched with unusual attention and unusual respect. And through all of it, wires on the scalp are quietly recording the electrical weather of each brain, the whole clattering, clapping chorus of it, second by second, right across the threshold. For 2 of those 4 people, the trace does exactly what the textbook orders. The breathing stops, the heart falters and quits, the fuel begins to fail, and the electrical weather sinks toward the flat calm we were all taught to expect. No surprises there. The theory holds. The room goes empty on schedule. But for the other 2, something happens that the people watching the screens would have called impossible if they had not been staring straight at it. In the seconds after the heart falls still, when there is no pulse, no breath, no blood carrying oxygen up into the skull, the fast clapping does not fade. It erupts. That high gamma rhythm, the footprint of a mind that is wide awake and present, the very signature we spend our waking lives producing, does not sputter out. It climbs. In one of these dying brains, it rises to something like 392 times the strength it had when the person was, by every ordinary measure, simply lying there. Nearly 400 times over. In a brain that the coroner would tell you is already crossing into death. In a brain with no fresh oxygen reaching it at all. Now stop, and let us be very careful, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a curious mind gets excited and stops thinking straight. A surge on a screen is not a soul. A big number is not a memory, or a face, or a feeling of floating up near the ceiling. All we truly have, so far, is a trace, a rhythm doing the opposite of what every clean theory said it would do, at the one instant we were most sure the theater had gone dark and empty. That is the anomaly. That is the roar in the room that should have been quiet. And a good detective, faced with a roar he cannot explain, does not leap to the grandest possible answer. He asks a smaller, sharper question first. He asks, where? Where in this dying brain is the roar actually coming from? Because it turns out the fast clapping did not break out just anywhere. It gathered itself in one particular place, and the place it chose is going to make the hair stand up on your arms. So let me tell you where. In the brain, up on each side, a little behind and above where the top of your ear meets your skull, there is a patch of tissue where 3 great territories of the cortex come crashing together. The part that hears, the part that touches and feels the body, the part that sees. Right at the seam where those 3 meet, there is a crossroads. Anatomists gave it a plain, sturdy name. They call it the temporal parietal junction. And of all the places in a dying brain where a roar of fast, organized electricity could break out, this crossroads is very nearly the last place a tidy theory would want it to be. Here is why. This little crossroads is not where you hear a sound, or feel a touch, or see a color. It is where those separate reports get stitched together into one thing. It is a workshop. Its job, near as we can tell, is to take the flood of signals pouring in from the body and the world, and to build out of them a single, quiet, unspoken conviction. The conviction that you are here, that you are inside this body, looking out, located at one particular spot in the room, roughly behind your own eyes. You never think about that conviction. You do not have to. It runs underneath everything, like the foundation under a house. You feel where your hands are without checking. You feel that the voice in your head is coming from inside you and not from the far wall. All of that whole seamless feeling of being a self planted in one place, gets assembled at this crossroads. Now think about what it means for the loudest, fastest activity in a shutting down brain to gather itself precisely there. It would be a little like walking through a factory at closing time. All the machines winding down, the lights going off one hallway at a time, and finding that in one room, the room where they assemble the final product, the workers are suddenly moving faster than they ever moved during the day shift. You would stop. You would stand in the doorway. And you would ask a very simple question. Why there? Why of all rooms, that one? And it gets stranger, because we already know something about this crossroads from a completely different direction. We did not have to wait for anyone to die to learn what happens when you meddle with it. Surgeons and scientists working on living, waking people have touched this region gently with a small electric current. They were not trying to do anything dramatic. And the people on the table reported the most extraordinary thing. They said quite calmly that they had left their bodies, that they were now up near the ceiling or off to the side, looking down at themselves lying there. Turn the current off and they drop right back in, snug behind their own eyes as if nothing had happened. Turn it on and out they go again. The very machinery that keeps you feeling planted inside yourself can be nudged, and when you nudge it, the self comes unmoored and floats. So this is not a vague region. This is the region that builds the felt boundary between you and the rest of the world. It is the map maker that decides where you stop and the room begins. And the electrical roar at death, the fast clapping at 392 times what it should be, did not spread out evenly across the whole brain like a blanket. It concentrated. It gathered right at the map maker's desk. In the one workshop whose entire trade is the feeling of being a located self, at the exact moment that self was supposed to be dissolving into nothing. I want you to notice how careful we have to be here, because there are two doors out of this room and they lead to very different places. Behind the first door is a thrilling story. The map maker, the story goes, is not shutting down. It is doing its final, most furious work. It is redrawing the map. The boundary between self and world, the one it has maintained faithfully your whole life, is coming apart, and as it comes apart, the self spills over its own edges and out into the room, up toward the ceiling. And the person, if there is still a person in there, feels themselves rise and look down. That would be a physical explanation, a real one, for one of the oldest and most stubbornly repeated reports in all of human experience. Not a ghost, not a miracle, just a crossroads losing its grip on the map it drew. Behind the second door is a much plainer story, and an honest detective has to keep his hand on that door too. The plainer story says this: a brain starved of blood and oxygen is a brain in chaos. When you throw a system into chaos, sometimes it does not simply fade. Sometimes it convulses. Sometimes it flares. A fire, right before it dies for lack of fuel, will often leap up brighter for a moment as the last of the wax or the last of the wood gives itself all at once. Maybe the gamma surge is that. A last leaping of the flame. And maybe it lands at the crossroads not because anything meaningful is happening there, but simply because that patch of tissue, wired the way it is, packed the way it is the part most prone to flaring when the whole system loses its footing. On that reading, there is a lot of smoke and no fire at all. A dying machine rattling loudly as it stops, signifying nothing. And I have to tell you plainly that from the trace alone, from the surge on the screen, we cannot yet say which door is the right one. We have a suspect at the scene of the crime. We have caught him standing over the body at the worst possible moment, doing something we did not expect. That is not the same as proving what he did. A detective who arrests the first man he finds at the scene, just because he is there and behaving oddly, is a bad detective, and he sends innocent men to jail. We are not going to do that. We are going to hold both doors open, and we are going to go looking for more. But before we leave this crossroads, sit with the shape of the puzzle for a moment, because the shape of it is beautiful and I do not want you to rush past it. Everything we thought we knew said the following: consciousness needs a working brain. Stop the blood, starve the tissue, and consciousness must go out, the way a bulb goes out when you pull the cord. Simple. Clean. And for most of the brain, in those first terrible seconds, that is more or less what the readings show. Quiet. Falling. Going dark. But right at the one address that specializes in the feeling of being a located self, at the moment the cord is pulled, something does not go quietly. Something gets faster. Something gets more organized, not less. The one part of the brain whose whole job is to tell you where you are and that you are throws its loudest signal at the very instant it is supposed to fall silent forever. If you were writing a mystery novel and you put that in, an editor would send it back and tell you it was too neat, too on the nose, too obviously meaningful. Nature does not care about editors. Nature put it exactly there. Now, a single strange reading, however lovely its location, is still just one witness, and a good case is never built on one witness. 2 of 4 patients showed the surge, the other 2 did not. 4 is a small number. Coma is a complicated state. The people whose brains we were reading could not be asked what, if anything, they felt, because they were gone. So the trace, for all its drama, is mute. It shows us the roar, but it cannot tell us whether anyone was home to hear it. Which means, if we want to know whether that final electrical storm carries any experience inside it, any last flicker of somebody in there, we have to go find people who came back. People whose hearts stopped, whose brains crossed into that same dark territory, and who then, against the odds, returned to tell us what it was like from the inside. Because the surge on the screen is the crime as seen from the hallway. The people who came back are the only ones who were ever in the room. And there are more of them than you might think. They have been telling us the same handful of things in the same order for as long as anyone has bothered to write it down, from cultures that never met and languages that share no root. For a long time, serious people waved all of that away as superstition, or wishful thinking, or the ordinary comfort we invent to soften a terror none of us escapes. Maybe it is exactly that, but you do not get to wave a thing away in science just because you would prefer it not to be true, any more than you get to embrace it just because you would love it to be true. You have to go and look. You have to gather the witnesses, sit them down, and listen very carefully, not to whether their story pleases you, but to whether the details line up in ways that a comfortable fairy tale has no reason to. So that is where we go next, out of the laboratory, away from the electrodes and the numbers, and into the wards where hundreds of ordinary people, plumbers and grandmothers and school teachers, were pronounced dead, and then were not, and woke with something to say. Let us go and hear them out. There is a physician named Sam Parnia, and he works at a medical school in New York, and he had caught the same stubborn itch that comes to any honest investigator when the evidence and the official story will not sit quietly in the same room together. He did not want anecdotes traded over dinner. He wanted the thing done properly, the way you would do it if you suspected the textbook had missed something and you were determined to be the last person fooled. So he and his colleagues set up a study, and they gave it a plain, sturdy name, and they ran it across hospitals in 2 countries, in the United States and in the United Kingdom, from the spring of the year 2017 all the way to the early part of 2020. And into that study came 567 people, every one of them a person whose heart had stopped. Not resting, not sleeping. Stopped. These were cardiac arrests, real ones, with the whole emergency machinery roaring into motion, the chest compressions, the shouting, the counting. Now think for a moment about how strange it is even to attempt this. You cannot schedule a death. You cannot ask a volunteer to please stop living for a few minutes so you can wire them up and take notes. The event comes when it comes, in the middle of the night, in a corridor, in a bed by a window, and it comes without warning and without permission. So to catch it in the act, you have to be ready everywhere, all the time, patient as a fisherman, waiting for a thing you hope with half your heart will not happen, and know with the other half certainly will. That patience alone tells you these were serious people. And what they were fishing for was the electrical weather of the brain during the very minutes the body was, by every ordinary standard, dead. Here is the first thing they hauled up out of that dark water. Roughly half of those people showed exactly what your school book predicts. The brain's electrical signal, watched on the monitor, went quiet. Suppressed or gone altogether. Flat. Just the way we said it would go earlier, the orchestra falling silent instrument by instrument until there is nothing left to hear. If the story ended there, it would be a tidy story, and I could send you off to sleep with a clean conscience. But the story does not end there, because the other half did not go quietly at all. In the other half of these patients, with the heart stopped and the blood not moving and the brain plainly starving for oxygen, the monitors picked up something that has no business being there. Not noise, not the random flicker of dying cells. Actual organized rhythms, the recognizable named patterns that a brain makes when it is doing its work. The slow deep rolling ones we call delta, the ones a little quicker that we call theta. The steady middle ones, alpha, and the fast crisp ones, beta. These are not exotic. These are the ordinary signatures of a working mind, the kinds of waves you would find in someone thinking, resting, drifting, dreaming, paying attention. And they were appearing in a brain that, by the strict arithmetic of blood and oxygen, should have had nothing left to spend. Marked cerebral ischemia, the doctors call it, which is just a careful way of saying the tissue is being choked of its supply. And yet, up out of that choked and darkened tissue came the rhythms of a mind at work. So sit with that a moment, the way a detective sits with a fingerprint that appears on a locked door. The body says dead. The instrument says thinking. Both readings taken from the same person at the same minute. That is not an answer. That is a contradiction. And a contradiction is the most valuable thing an investigator can find. Because a contradiction means one of your assumptions is wrong, and you get to have the pleasure of discovering which one. But Panya did not stop at the tracings on the machine, because some of these people, the ones fortunate enough to be pulled back, woke up. And when they woke, a certain number of them had something to say. Now you must understand my caution here. When somebody comes back from the edge and tells you a story, the easiest thing in the world and the laziest is to either swallow it whole or throw it out whole. Neither of those is thinking. Thinking is when you collect a great many such stories from a great many different people. People who never met, people with different lives and different fears and different words for things, and then you look coldly to see whether the stories are just a scatter of private dreams or whether they fall, against all odds, into a shape. And what Panya reported is that they fall into a shape. Not always, not in everyone, but often enough and consistently enough to make a careful man lean forward. The shape goes something like this, told again and again in different accents. First, a separation, a sense of coming loose from the body, of watching from somewhere off to the side, and, oddly, not with dulled, fuzzy, fading awareness the way you would expect from a brain running out of fuel, but with awareness that felt sharper than usual, clearer, more real than ordinary life. Then a sense of travel, of going somewhere, towards some destination. Then something these people describe as a review, and this is the part that I find hardest to wave away, because it is so specific. A review of the life just lived, but not a scrapbook, not a pleasant slideshow of birthdays. A moral accounting, a weighing of the things one had done, and, more pointedly, of why one had done them, the intentions behind the acts examined as if from outside with a kind of unflinching honesty that people do not usually manage about themselves. Then, For many, the sense of arriving at a place that felt, of all things, like home. And then the return, separation, journey, reckoning, a home-like place, and the coming back. That is the arc, retraced by strangers who had no way of comparing notes. Now I want to be scrupulously fair, because being fair is the whole game. Pania looked hard at whether these were simply hallucinations, whether they were the fever dreams of a brain drowning in its own chemistry, or the visions that certain drugs can conjure, or the confabulations a mind stitches together afterward to paper over a blank. And his considered conclusion, having gathered his witnesses and listened as carefully as anyone has, was that these accounts do not resemble hallucinations, and do not resemble drug-induced states. They have a different texture. They are ordered where hallucination is chaotic. They are consistent across people where hallucination is wildly personal. And so, from all of this, Pania said a thing that I want you to carry with you into whatever dream is waiting for you tonight. He said that death is not an absolute state, that it is instead a process. And a process, unlike a wall, is something you can be somewhere along. Something with a middle. Something that he dared to suggest might, under the right conditions, even be reversed. A process, not a wall. Hold on to the difference, because it changes the entire investigation. If death is a wall, then the gamma surge and the delta and the alpha rhythms and the life review are all noise from the wrong side of a boundary already crossed, and we are fools to make anything of them. But if death is a process, a slope, a corridor with length to it, then all these strange readings are events happening inside the process, in territory we simply never had the instruments or the nerve to explore before. And the map of that corridor is, at this moment, almost entirely blank. But I promised you I would be your partner and not your preacher, and a good partner is the one who says the uncomfortable thing out loud before the other fellow can. So let me say it. There is an obvious objection sitting in the corner of this room, arms folded, and it has been sitting there this whole time, and it deserves its say. The objection goes like this. Of course, a dying brain produces vivid experiences. A dying brain is a brain in chaos, flooded, starved, misfiring, and a starved, misfiring brain is exactly the sort of thing that would throw off sparks, that would manufacture light and motion and the powerful feeling of significance, the way a struck match throws a flare just before it gutters out. The whole tunnel, the whole review, the whole sense of peace might be nothing more than the last theatrical performance of an organ going down, a show with an audience of one and no meaning behind the curtain. That is the hallucination hypothesis, and it is not stupid. It is, in fact, the sensible default, the thing a careful skeptic ought to reach for first. So we have a duty now, before we go any further, before we let ourselves get carried off by microtubules and quantum collapse and information that may or may not survive. We have to take that folded arm skeptic seriously. We have to walk straight into his objection and see whether it holds, or whether when you press on it, it gives way in some particular and revealing spot. Because if the dying brain is merely putting on a light show, then the specifics should not line up. The tunnel should be one man's tunnel and another man's flood and a third man's roaring. The review should be random. And yet we were just told the details do line up, across people who never spoke. So which is it? That is the seam we have to work at next, gently with the fingernails, and see what comes loose. Think about how a hallucination usually works. When a fever takes hold of a child and the room fills with shapes, those shapes belong to that child alone. They come from his own private stock of fears. The dog that frightened him, the crack in his own ceiling, the face of somebody he knows. Give the same fever to 100 children and you get 100 different rooms. That is the signature of a thing manufactured inside one skull. It is idiosyncratic. It is personal. It bears the fingerprints of the particular brain that made it. The way a dream you had last night could not possibly be mistaken for mine. So if the dying brain is simply a projector throwing pictures on a screen because the oxygen has run low and the chemistry has gone wild, then we should expect exactly that scatter. 1,000 deaths, 1,000 unrelated shows. No two alike. And that is precisely what we do not find. That is the loose thread. When the doctor who ran that large study of 567 people across hospitals in 2 countries sat down and sorted through what the survivors told him, He kept meeting the same story wearing different clothes. First, a sense of coming loose from the body, and not a dim drugged loosening, but the opposite. A feeling of being more awake, more lucid, sharper than in ordinary life. Then a sense of moving, of being drawn towards some place or destination. Then a review, and here is the part that ought to give any careful person pause, because it is so odd and so specific. Not a slideshow of pretty memories. A review with a moral spine to it. People described reliving their actions from the outside, and judging themselves, weighing the intentions behind what they had done, feeling the effect of their choices on other people as if from the other side of the exchange. Then a sense of reaching a place that felt like home, and then the return. Separation, journey, reckoning, homecoming, return. That arc, again and again, in people who had never met, who came from different lives, who had no way to compare notes. Now the skeptic is a good scientist, and he does not fold at the first strange fact. He says, all right, but people know the story in advance. They have heard of the tunnel and the light. They are simply filling in the blanks with the script the culture handed them. And that is a fair objection, it really is, and I would not throw it out. But notice what it fails to explain. It does not explain the reckoning. The tunnel and the light are famous. The cold, exact, self-judging life review, weighed by intention rather than by pleasantness, is not the thing people expect, and it is not what a frightened brain reaching for comfort would be likely to invent. A comforting hallucination flatters you. This one, by every account, does not flatter. It confronts. That is a peculiar thing for a mere chemical light show to do, and peculiar things are exactly what a detective lives for. So the man who gathered these accounts drew a careful conclusion, and I want to state it precisely, because precision is the whole game here. He did not say, "This proves the soul departs the body." A serious person does not say that from this evidence. What he said was narrower, and to my mind, more interesting. He said these experiences do not look like hallucinations. They do not look like the confusion of a drugged or oxygen-starved mind, which tends to be fragmented, jumbled, forgotten within the hour. These, by contrast, come back structured, ordered, and vivid, and they are remembered for years with a clarity that ordinary dreams never keep. Something about the phenomenon refuses to fit the tidy box we wanted to put it in. That is not an answer. It is a better-shaped question, and a better-shaped question is worth more than a wrong answer. And then, sitting underneath all the words, is that stubborn machine reading we already met. Because remember, this is not only a matter of what people say afterward. In roughly half of those 567 people, the electrical trace of the brain did not simply go dark and stay dark. It showed rhythms, the slow rolling delta waves, the theta, the alpha, the beta, the ordinary alphabet of a working brain, appearing in an organ that was, by every measure of blood and oxygen, in severe trouble. Marked shortage of blood to the brain, and yet the machine drawing the kind of lines it draws in a mind that is doing something. You cannot wave that away as a story someone told. A pen on a strip of paper does not know the cultural script for dying. It only writes what the voltage tells it to write. So the hallucination hypothesis, when you press on it with a fingernail, does not shatter, but it does give. It bends in one particular place. It can account for scattered, private, forgettable visions. It cannot easily account for a shared structure across strangers, nor for a self-judging reckoning nobody would invent for comfort, nor for a brain that keeps drawing organized rhythms while it starves. The skeptic is not defeated, but he has been moved off his comfortable chair, and now he is standing, arms still folded, but frowning at the paper strip, because it will not say what he needs it to say. Here I want to be honest with you about the shape of an investigation like this, because it would be easy to cheat, and I do not want to cheat. Bending is not breaking. The fact that a simple explanation feels incomplete does not entitle us to run off and grab a wild one. Plenty of things in nature looked mysterious for a while and then turned out to be perfectly ordinary once somebody measured the right quantity. So the responsible move, the only move, is to ask, what would settle this? What measurement, if we made it, would tell the light show hypothesis from something stranger? And happily, one of the sharpest minds in the study of consciousness handed us exactly such a test, and it is beautifully simple, and it does not require us to believe anything at all in advance. He pointed out that if those bursts of fast electrical rhythm at the edge of death, those high-frequency oscillations, the ones between about 25 and 150 cycles per second, if those really are the physical shadow of some vivid inner experience, then they are not sacred to dying. They are a signature of a brain state, and a brain state can, in principle, be produced by other means. There are certain chemical agents, the ones that dissolve the ordinary sense of a bounded self, that people who have taken them describe in language uncannily close to the language of the deathbed. The coming loose, the vastness, the dissolving of the line between me and everything else. If the deathbed gamma and the drug state experience are truly the same thing seen from two doors, then the machine should say so. Put a person in that chemically altered state, watch the same fast rhythms bloom in the same regions of the brain, and you would have tied the mystical report of the dying to a perfectly repeatable, perfectly earthly cause. You would have brought the phenomenon indoors, out of the weather, onto the laboratory bench where it can be poked at any afternoon you like. I find that a wonderful move, and I want you to notice why. It does not sneer at the strange reports, and it does not swallow them whole. It says, let us make the reports pay rent. Let us extract from all this wonder a single hard prediction, a thing that must be true if the ordinary explanation is right, a thing we can go and check. That is science keeping its feet on the ground even while it is looking at the ceiling. And the honest state of things is that this is a prediction, not yet a verdict. It points somewhere. Nobody has closed the book, which means we are still, at this hour, genuinely inside the mystery and not pretending. But now watch what has quietly happened to our case while we were busy with the skeptic. We came in asking whether the dying brain merely flickers as it fails, and instead we have been driven, step by grudging step, to a much deeper and much older question, one that has nothing to do with hospitals or heart monitors, and everything to do with what a mind is made of in the first place. Because all of this, the gamma surge, the shared arc, the organized rhythms in a starving cortex, all of it presses on a single sore spot. It asks whether the thing we call awareness is nothing but the traffic of signals across the wet meat of the brain, so that when the traffic stops, the awareness is simply gone, the way a city goes dark when the power fails. Or whether there is something else going on down there, something at a level far below the firing of cells, something in the very fine grain of matter, that our ordinary picture of the brain has been quietly leaving out. And that is where a physicist and a doctor of anesthesia walked in, back in the middle of the 1990s, with an idea so strange and so bold that most of their colleagues laughed and a few could not stop thinking about it. They looked past the cells, past the connections between the cells, down into a scaffolding hidden inside every neuron, tiny hollow rods too small to see in any ordinary way. And they asked a question that sounds, at first, completely mad. What if the deepest secret of the mind is not in the wiring at all? What if it is quantum? What if, down in those little tubes, the strange rules of the very small are doing the one thing our whole tidy picture forbids them from doing inside a warm, wet, noisy body? Let us follow those two into the dark and see whether they were dreaming or whether they had caught the scent of something real. First, let me show you these little rods, because they are worth knowing about even if you never care a whit about the mind. Inside every one of your neurons, holding the whole soft cell up like the poles inside a tent, there is a scaffolding. Biologists call it the cytoskeleton, the skeleton of the cell, and a great deal of it is built out of tiny hollow tubes. Microtubules, they are called. Picture a drinking straw, but far, far thinner, and built not from plastic but from thousands of little protein beads packed side by side in a spiral, wound around and around to make the wall of the tube. Each little bead is a molecule called tubulin, and it can sit in more than one shape, the way a light switch can be up or down, or the way a small hinge can fold one way or the other. So already you have something that smells a bit like the little switches we use for counting and storing, except these are grown, not manufactured, and there are an enormous number of them threaded through every cell in your head. Now the ordinary biologist looks at these tubes and says, fine, they are girders. They hold the cell in shape. They act as little railways that ferry cargo from one end of the neuron to the other. Very useful, very mechanical, nothing mysterious about it. And for most purposes, that is exactly the right way to think. But the physicist and the doctor of anesthesia I told you about looked at those same little tubes and asked a wilder question. They asked whether, down inside that hollow, sheltered from the sloshing salty fluid of the cell, the tubulin beads might be doing something that is not merely mechanical at all. Whether they might be holding, however briefly, the strange double life that the very small things of this world are allowed to hold. Whether a single bead could be, in some faint sense, folded both ways at once, and whether many beads up and down a tube and across many tubes could share that double condition together in step the way a crowd can fall into a single rhythm without anyone conducting them. That shared, double condition is the thing physicists call a superposition. It is the heart of all the quantum weirdness, and it is worth pausing on, because everything that follows hangs from it. When something very small, an electron, an atom, is left to itself and not disturbed, it does not have to pick. It can be here and there together. It can be doing this and that together. Not swapping quickly back and forth, mind you. Both, genuinely, at the same time, in a way that has no picture in our everyday world, and yet shows up in the arithmetic again and again and never once lets us down. The trouble is that this double life is delicate. Terribly delicate. The moment the small thing gets tangled up with its noisy surroundings, with the jostling of warm molecules all around it, the doubling seems to vanish, and you are left with just one plain answer, here or there, this or that. We say the superposition has decohered, which is a long word meaning the outside world has poked at the secret and spoiled it. So the picture these two men were selling asks a great deal. It asks that inside a warm body, at the temperature of fresh soup, in a cell that is essentially a bag of salt water in constant thermal riot, the little tubulin beads could keep their doubled life going long enough to matter. Long enough to do a kind of reckoning, a computation that no ordinary switch could do. That is a tall order, and we will see in a little while just how tall, because a clever man with a pencil is going to come along and tell them it cannot possibly be done. But hold that objection. First, let me give you the second half of their idea, because it is the half the physicists truly cared about, and it is the half that reaches all the way to the question we started with, the question of what becomes of you when the heart stops. Here is the second half. The physicist did not believe that a superposition simply drifts along forever until the environment happens to knock it over. He thought that a superposition carries within itself the seed of its own ending. His reasoning ran through gravity of all things, which is a strange guest to invite to this particular dinner. Think of it this way. When a little lump of matter sits in two places at once, it is not only the matter that is doubled. Matter bends space around it ever so slightly, the way a heavy fruit dimples the surface of a trampoline. So a lump in two places means space itself is being pulled into two slightly different shapes at once. Two different dimples in the fabric of the world held together. And the physicist's hunch was that nature will not tolerate that disagreement about the shape of space for very long. The deeper you push two versions of space-time apart, the more unstable the arrangement becomes, and at some moment the whole thing simply chooses. It settles into one shape. The doubling ends, not because a passing molecule spoiled it, but on its own, from the inside, by the rules of gravity itself. He called this an objective reduction, meaning a real self-driven collapse. One that would happen even in perfect isolation, with nobody watching and nothing bumping into it. And he even gave you a way to guess how long the doubling lasts before it snaps. The recipe is beautifully short. The lifetime, call it tau, is roughly equal to one of the deepest constants in all of physics, Planck's constant, the tiny number that sets the scale of the whole quantum world, divided by an energy. And what energy? It is the gravitational self-energy of the split, the amount you would have to pay, so to speak, to keep the two dimpled versions of space apart. That energy grows with the mass involved, roughly as the mass multiplied by itself, and it grows as the two positions are pulled farther from each other. Written out in plain speech, the energy is the gravitational constant, the same big number that governs the fall of apples and the swing of the moon, times the mass squared, divided by the little distance between the two locations. Put a bigger mass in two places, or pull those places farther apart, and the energy climbs and the lifetime shrinks and the doubling snaps almost at once. Keep the mass small and the split tiny, and the doubling can, in principle, linger. Sit with what that little recipe is really saying, because it is quite something. It ties the flicker of a quantum choice, the most delicate event in the small world, to gravity, the gentlest and grandest force in the large one. It says the reason a superposition ends is written in the geometry of space. And that is why this idea, of all the ideas about the mind, is the one a physicist gets out of bed for. Most theories of consciousness never leave the biology. This one reaches down past the neuron, past the little tube, past the tubular bead, all the way to the shape of space-time, and it claims that every conscious moment is a tiny orchestrated shudder of that geometry choosing itself. They called the whole scheme orchestrated objective reduction. Orchestrated, because the tubes and their helpers were supposed to tune and time the collapses like a conductor bringing in the sections of an orchestra. Objective reduction for the gravity-driven snap we just walked through. And here, at last, is why I have dragged you all the way down into those hollow rods. Follow the logic to its end. If your conscious moments really are these little collapses in the fine grain of the tubes, then ask what happens when the heart stops and the power fails and the tubes lose their delicate order. In the ordinary picture, that is simply the end. The information that was you, the pattern, gets scrambled and lost as the machinery breaks. But in this stranger picture, the quantum information riding in those tubes does not obviously vanish. When the coherence collapses for the last time, that information, the men who dreamed this up suggested, might not be destroyed so much as released, decohering outward into the fundamental geometry of space itself, the very fabric their whole theory was built upon. I want to be honest and careful with you here, and say plainly that this last step is the most speculative part of the whole affair, far past anything we can test, closer to a hope dressed in equations than to a finding. But you can see why it set people talking. It is the first time in our whole investigation that a serious physical theory with a real equation in it has whispered that the pattern of a mind might not simply blink out with the last heartbeat. So there they stood in the middle of that decade, the physicist and the anesthesiologist, holding a picture that reached from the shape of space-time to the moment of death, and asking the world to take it seriously. It was bold. It was gorgeous. And it had, sitting right at its foundation, that one enormous assumption I asked you to hold in your hand a few minutes ago, that the little tubes could keep their doubled quantum life alive, long enough to matter inside a warm and wet and endlessly noisy brain. Everything, the collapses, the orchestration, the whispered survival of the pattern, everything rested on that single plank, and a plank is exactly the sort of thing a careful man with a sharp pencil likes to test. Somewhere off to the side of all this wonder, such a man was already sitting down at his desk, sharpening that pencil and beginning to do the one thing that can turn a beautiful idea to dust in an afternoon. He was starting to calculate. The man's name was Max Tegmark, and the year was 1999, and what he did was so quiet and so ordinary that you could have walked past his office and never guessed that a whole cathedral of thought was being weighed on the back of an envelope inside. He did not go into a laboratory. He did not build a machine. He simply asked the question that every beautiful idea must eventually answer, which is, how long? Not whether the little tubes could hold a doubled quantum life. Suppose they could. Suppose you started one up, right now, inside a living brain, warm and pink and busy. How long would it last before the world outside reached in and smudged it into nothing? You have to understand what quantum coherence actually is if you want to feel the weight of that question. It is the most delicate thing in nature. A particle held in two possibilities at once is like a soap film stretched across a hoop on a windy afternoon. While nothing touches it, it shimmers, it holds both of its faces, it is genuinely undecided. But let one speck of dust land, let one breath of warm air brush across it, and the film does not slowly sag. It pops. It is gone all at once, and the two faces become one, and the undecidedness is over. In physics, we call that popping decoherence, and the rule of it is brutally simple. The more the little quantum thing is jostled, poked, warmed, and bumped by everything around it, the faster it pops. A cold, still, empty place lets the shimmer live. A hot, crowded, trembling place kills it almost before it begins. And a brain, when you look at it honestly, is about the worst place in the known universe to try to keep a soap film intact. It is warm, a steady 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which to an atom is a furnace of ceaseless kicking. It is wet, soaked through with salty water and drifting ions, every one of them a little charged fist knocking on every door. And it is packed, crammed so full of jostling molecules that nothing sits still for even an instant. Warm, wet, and noisy. That was the phrase, and it became the flag under which a whole army of skeptics would march. Tegmark took those three ordinary words and he turned them into a number. He worked out how quickly all that heat and wetness and jostling would reach into a microtubule and smudge out any quantum shimmer living inside it. And the number he came back with was not close. It was not a near miss. The shimmer, he found, would collapse in something like 10 to the minus 13 seconds, and in some of his estimates as fast as 10 to the minus 20 seconds. Let me try to give those numbers a body, because written as words they can float past you. 10 to the minus 13 of a second is a tenth of a trillionth of a second. We call that neighborhood the femtosecond. 10 to the minus 20 is very much smaller still, down in what we call attoseconds, a span so short that light itself, the fastest thing there is, crosses only a sliver of a single atom before the time is up. That is how long Tegmark said the quantum secret could survive in the heat of a living brain. A flicker beneath a flicker beneath a flicker. Now set that against the clock the brain actually keeps. A neuron does its work, fires its signal, passes its whisper to the next cell on a timescale of milliseconds, thousandths of a second. That is the tempo of thought, the heartbeat of the machinery of mind. And here is the chasm that opened up under the whole gorgeous edifice, between the femtosecond when the quantum shimmer dies and the millisecond when the neuron finally gets around to doing anything. There is a gap of something like 10 orders of magnitude, 10 powers of 10, a factor of 10 billion. The soap film pops 10 billion times over before the cell has taken its first step. It is as if you tried to send a message across a country by whispering it once, softly, and then waiting a full year for the letter to arrive. By the time anyone is listening, the whisper died so long ago that it may as well never have been spoken. Whatever the microtubule was supposedly computing in its private quantum theater, the theater burned down 10 billion times before a single neuron opened its eyes to watch the play. That was the blow. That was the sharpened pencil turning wonder to dust in an afternoon. And the mood among the doubters was not gentle. One philosopher of the mind, Patricia Churchland, put the whole objection into a single dismissive little phrase that stuck to the theory like a burr. She said the quantum consciousness idea had no more explanatory value than pixie dust in the synapses. Pixie dust. You can hear the shrug in it. You can hear a person saying, "You have taken two mysteries you do not understand, the quantum world and the conscious mind, and you have simply glued them together and called the glue an answer." That is a fair thing to worry about. It is one of the oldest traps in all of thinking, to explain one puzzle by pointing at a bigger puzzle and pretending the pointing was a solution. So there is our investigation seemingly closed with a slam. A beautiful suspect, motive and all, and then a man with an envelope proving the suspect could not possibly have been at the scene, not for a femtosecond, let alone long enough to commit the crime of consciousness. If you were writing the tidy version of this story, you would stop here, brush off your hands, and go home. The quantum gambit ruled out. The warm, wet brain too noisy for such delicate business. Case closed. But a good detective does not trust a case that closes too neatly, and neither should we. Because a calculation, however sharp the pencil, is still an argument on paper. It rests on assumptions about how sealed the microtubule is, how shielded, how quiet its little inner chamber really stays. Tegmark had to guess at those things, and reasonable people guess differently, and a paper argument, no matter how forceful, is never quite the same as reaching into nature and asking her directly. What the fight really needed was not a better envelope. It needed an experiment. It needed somebody to go and physically hunt for the fingerprint that this whole theory, if it were true, would have to leave behind. And the fingerprint, if you follow Penrose's picture to its root, is a very peculiar thing. Remember that in his version, the quantum shimmer does not pop because the warm brain smudged it. It pops on its own, because space-time itself cannot hold two versions of matter apart forever. And when it collapses that way, on its own, driven by the geometry of space, the theory says a tiny, tiny puff of energy should be released. A whisper of radiation. Not from chemistry, not from any ordinary source, but purely from the act of the universe deciding between two possibilities. If that whisper is real, you could catch it. You would only need a detector patient enough and a place quiet enough to hear something so faint. So they went looking. And the place they chose to listen was not a brain at all. It was a mountain. Deep under the Gran Sasso Massif in Italy, some 1,400 meters of solid rock below the town of L'Aquila, there is a laboratory carved into the stone. People go down there to escape the ceaseless rain of particles that showers the surface of the world every second, the cosmic sparks that would drown out any faint signal you were trying to hear. Under all that rock, the noise of the sky is hushed almost to silence. It is one of the stillest places human beings have ever made, a cathedral of quiet built precisely so that nature can be heard whispering. And in the summers of 2014 and 2015, a physicist named Catalina Coscianu and her colleagues set up an experiment down there in the dark. They took a cylinder of germanium, a patient and watchful crystal, and they simply waited, listening for that peculiar puff of radiation that gravity-driven collapse was supposed to make. If the universe really was popping quantum superpositions on its own, in the way Penrose needed for his whole scheme to run, then a very specific faint glow of radiation ought to have appeared in that germanium, a fingerprint left at the scene by the collapsing state itself. They watched. They waited. And they heard nothing. No glow, no whisper, no fingerprint. Where the theory demanded a signal, there was only the deep quiet of the mountain. When Coscianu sat down to work out what that silence meant, she came to a conclusion that pressed on Orch or from a wholly new direction. Not with an envelope this time, but with an empty detector. She reasoned that for the collapse to happen fast enough to keep pace with a conscious moment, to do its work in something like 0.025 of a second, the brain would need to muster something on the order of 10 to the 23rd of the little protein units, the tubulins, all cooperating at once. 10 to the 23rd, but the entire human brain, every neuron, every microtubule top to bottom, holds only about 10 to the 20th tubulins in total. That is a shortfall of a factor of 1,000. The brain, in other words, does not even own enough of the raw material to run the machine the simplest version of the theory requires. And so she judged the whole idea, at least in that plainest form, to be highly implausible. Two blows now from two different worlds. A theorist with a pencil and an empty crystal under a mountain. Either one alone might have been shrugged off. Together they seem to bury the quantum suspect for good, which is exactly the moment in any honest investigation when you should feel a small cold prickle at the back of your neck. Because we have buried this idea rather thoroughly now, twice over, and a story that keeps insisting on burying the same suspect is often a story hiding something it does not want you to notice. So before we walk away from the grave, let us do the thing the tidy version never does. Let us turn around, go back to the laboratory bench, and look very carefully at what nature had to say for herself in the years that followed. Come back down the stairs with me into that quiet room, and let me show you the thing the tidy obituary left off the page. Because while the theorists were sharpening their pencils, and the crystal under the mountain was sitting there refusing to glow, other people in other laboratories were poking at these little protein tubes in a different way. They were not asking whether gravity could collapse a wave function inside your head. They were asking a smaller, humbler question. Can these tubes do anything quantum at all? Anything at all, even a flicker, even for the briefest instant? And nature, it turns out, had an answer, and it was not the flat, bored no that everyone expected. Let me tell you what lives inside these microtubules. They are built out of a protein called tubulin. And tucked inside that protein, folded away in its architecture, is a little molecule called tryptophan. Now you may have heard that name before, because it is one of the ordinary building blocks of the food you eat and the flesh you are made of. But tryptophan has a private talent. It drinks ultraviolet light, shine the right invisible color on it, and it soaks up that light, holds it for a whisper of time, and then hands it back. A tiny absorber and emitter sitting there in the dark of the cell waiting. Now, one molecule doing this is nothing special. It is like a single person in an empty stadium clapping once. You would never hear it. But here is where it gets interesting, and here is the prediction the quantum idea had quietly made years before anyone could test it. Put many of these little emitters close together, arrange them in a lattice, in a repeating pattern, the way they actually sit inside a microtubule. And something can happen that does not happen to any of them alone. They can share the light. They can couple. And when they couple just right, they stop behaving like a scattered crowd of individuals and start behaving like one single thing. We have a name for this. We call it superradiance. And the everyday picture for it is a choir. When 100 singers each hum their own note at their own moment, you get a warm mush, a wash of sound, nothing sharp. But let those 100 voices lock onto the same note at the same instant, breathing together, and the sound that comes out is not 100 times louder. It is more coordinated than that. It has an edge to it, a coherence, a brightness that no single throat could ever produce. The whole becomes a new instrument. That is superradiance, except the singers are molecules and the note is a pulse of ultraviolet light, and the whole choir is packed inside a tube far too small for your eye to ever see. For years this was just an idea on paper, a maybe, a wouldn't it be something. And then, in the year 2024, a group of researchers went and looked carefully in the laboratory at networks of these tryptophan molecules. And they found it. They found the ultraviolet superradiance. The choir was real. These little protein tubes, the very same ones the whole quantum mind story hangs upon, really can pass light around among themselves in that coordinated, coherent, more than the sum of its parts way. One of the predictions that the strange theory had made, back when it was mostly being laughed at, turned out to be sitting there in nature, waiting to be confirmed. Now I want you to feel the shape of this moment, because it is delicate and it is easy to get carried away. This does not prove that your consciousness is a quantum choir. It does not prove that anything survives when the heart stops. What it proves is smaller and stranger and, in a way, more honest. It proves that the machinery is not as dead and dull as the skeptics assumed. The warm, wet, noisy objection said that these tubes could never do anything coherent, that the heat and the wetness and the constant molecular jostling would smother any quantum effect instantly, like trying to keep a candle lit in a hurricane. And here was a quantum optical effect, a real one, living inside the very structure that was supposed to be too warm and too wet and too noisy to hold one. The hurricane, it seems, has a sheltered corner. But I promised you an honest investigation, and an honest investigation does not fall in love with its own clue. So let me hand you the objection, the same way a careful detective hands you the fact that ruins his favorite theory, because you deserve to hold it in your own hands. Inside a real living neuron, there is another character in the story. There is a protein called ferritin, whose ordinary job is to hold on to iron, to store it safely so it does not run wild and cause damage. And ferritin, some critics point out, may be very good at soaking up exactly the kind of ultraviolet light that the tryptophan choir is singing, which would mean that in the glass dish, in the purified experiment, the choir sings beautifully, but in the crowded, iron-laced reality of a working brain cell, there may be something standing right next to the choir, absorbing the song before it can carry. The candle may be lit, but there may be a hand cupped over it. So we do not know. I want to say that plainly, because there is a great temptation in this whole subject to let a beautiful result do more work than it can bear. We have a genuine quantum effect confirmed in the isolated system, and a genuine unresolved question about whether that effect survives inside the living tissue. Both of those are true at once. That is not a failure. That is what the frontier actually looks like when you stand on it, instead of reading about it later in a textbook that has smoothed away all the doubt. And there was a second thing that happened that same year, from a completely different direction, and this one I find quietly wonderful. Somebody ran an experiment on rats, and it had nothing to do with light. It had to do with sleep. When you put an animal under anesthesia, you are, in a very real sense, switching off its consciousness for a while, gently and reversibly. The animal drifts down, the awareness winks out, and later it comes back up. Now the researchers took a drug, a substance called ipothalone B, and this drug has one particular effect. It goes into the cells and it stabilizes the macrotubules. It braces them. It makes those little protein tubes sturdier and steadier than they would otherwise be, the way you might run a length of tape along a wobbly scaffold to stop it flexing. And here is the finding. The rats given that drug, the rats whose microtubules had been braced and stiffened, took noticeably longer to lose consciousness when the anesthetic came. Longer to go under, as if strengthening the very structure at the heart of the quantum idea made consciousness cling on a little harder, resist the darkness a little more stubbornly, before finally letting go. Now think about what an anesthetic is supposed to do and where it is supposed to work. If consciousness were purely a matter of signals hopping across the little gaps between neurons, of chemistry sloshing back and forth in the ordinary way, then why on earth should reinforcing the internal skeleton of the cell change how long it takes to fall asleep? It should not matter. And yet it did. I do not want to oversell this either, and you know by now that I will not. It is one study, on rats, and it is what we call indirect evidence. It does not tell you how consciousness works. It does not resurrect the buried theory in its full, ambitious form. What it does is point a thin, insistent finger at the microtubule and say, this thing, this little tube, has something to do with awareness. It is not just structural plumbing. It is not just the girders that hold the cell up. Somehow it is threaded into the very process of being aware, being present, being someone rather than no one. So look at what we are holding now, on this side of the grave we dug so confidently a little while ago. We buried the quantum suspect twice, with a calculation and with an empty crystal, and both burials were fair and both were serious. And then nature, in her quiet, unhurried way, sent up 2 green shoots through the soil, a choir of light that really sings, at least in the dish, and a skeleton that when you stiffen it, makes the light of the mind linger. Neither shoot proves the theory. Both of them refuse to let it die. And this, I think, is where an honest person has to stop and admit that we may have been asking a slightly wrong question all along. We have been chasing this business as though the whole puzzle were about one specific machine inside the neuron, one gadget, one mechanism. Is it the tube? Is it the light? Is it the gravity? But there is another way to come at the mystery entirely, a way that does not care what the machine is made of. It does not ask what the parts are. It asks only how the parts are joined, how deeply they are woven together, how much they know about one another. It treats a mind not as a substance at all, but as a pattern. And if you follow that thread, you arrive at a very different notion of what it even means for a mind to end. Not a light going out. Something more like a fabric coming unwoven, thread by thread, until the pattern that was, you can no longer be told apart from the noise. Let us pick up that thread now and follow it down. Think of a photographic plate, the old kind coated with silver. You shine a bit of light on one grain and that grain darkens. It knows nothing about its neighbors. Every grain minds its own business. You could snip the plate into 1,000 little squares and each square would still do exactly what it did before, because there is no conversation between the parts. A photograph is a heap of independent facts sitting side by side. Now compare that to what your brain is doing while you listen to my voice. The part of you that hears the words is talking to the part that remembers what a word means, which is talking to the part that feels a little drowsy, which is talking to the part that notices the room is dim. It is all one conversation. Cut it in half and you do not get 2 smaller minds. You get something broken. That difference is the whole idea a fellow named Giulio Tononi, working at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, decided to take seriously. He said, suppose we stop asking what consciousness is made of and start measuring how much a system is genuinely unified. Not how many parts it has. How much the parts refuse to be separated. How much the whole knows that the sum of the pieces does not. He gave that quantity a name, a single Greek letter phi. And phi is meant to be a number. A big phi means a system that is deeply woven, where every thread pulls on every other thread, where the state of the whole could not be guessed from the parts taken one at a time. A small phi means a loose collection, a heap, a photographic plate. A camera has an enormous number of pixels and almost no phi at all, because the pixels do not care about each other. A sleeping brain has fewer active parts, perhaps, but they are still murmuring to one another, so its phi is not zero. An waking mind, richly aware, has phi running high. I want you to sit with how strange and how ordinary that idea is at the same time. It is strange because it says consciousness is not a thing you could point to, not a glow you could locate, but a property of arrangement. It is a measure of how much a system is more than its pieces. And it is ordinary because you already believe something like it. You already know that a friendship is not located in either friend. You already know that a melody is not in any single note. Take the notes out of their order, shuffle them, play them alone, and the tune is simply gone, though every note is still there. The tune lives in the relations, and this theory says you live there too. So follow what that must mean as the heart stops. We have been watching, all this while, the machinery fail, the energy drains, the pumps quit, the ions spill across the membranes in that slow, ruinous flood. But look at the same collapse through this other window, and you do not see machinery at all. You see a fabric, and the fabric is being pulled apart, not all at once, but thread by thread. Each connection that fails is one more strand cut. And here is the part that has a quiet cruelty to it. For a little while, cutting a few threads does not destroy the pattern. You can pull a dozen strands from a tapestry and still see the face in it. The picture degrades gracefully. It does not wink out. It fades, it coarsens, it loses its finest detail first, and only near the very end, when too many threads are gone, does the face stop being a face and become merely a tangle of colored string that could have meant anything or nothing. In the language of phi, this is a number sliding down towards zero, not falling off a cliff, sliding. And when it reaches zero, when there is no longer any sense in which the parts of that brain form a whole that exceeds them, the theory draws its line. That, it says, is where the conscious field goes out. Not when the last cell dies, not when the heart gives its last twitch, but at the moment the integration fails, the moment the conversation among the parts can no longer be told apart from each part talking only to itself. Phi equals zero. The lights are not switched off. The circuit that made them one lamp is simply undone, and what remains is a scatter of sparks that no longer add up to a flame. This most recent version of the theory, the fourth serious rewriting of it, was set down formally in the year 2023. And I would be doing you a disservice, a real disservice, if I let you think the whole community of thoughtful people stood up and applauded, because in that very same year, a large group of accomplished scholars, people who study minds and brains for a living, signed an open letter, a public complaint, in which they called this theory not merely wrong but something worse. They called it unfalsifiable pseudoscience. That is about as hard a thing as one scientist can say to another. It means we do not think you have given us any way to prove you wrong, and a claim that cannot possibly be proven wrong is not really a claim about nature at all. It is a poem wearing the costume of an equation. I tell you this fight not to pick a side, but because the fight itself is the clue. When the best people in a field cannot agree on whether an idea is deep truth or elegant nonsense, that is not a sign that somebody is being stupid. It is a sign that we have wandered up to the edge of what we actually know how to test. And the edge is exactly where we are standing in this investigation. We have a number that supposedly measures the presence of a soul, or something we are willing to call a soul with a straight face, and we have no agreed way to check the number against the world. So keep it in your pocket, do not throw it away, and do not swear by it. Hold it loosely, the way you hold a witness whose story is beautiful, but who cannot produce an alibi. There is, though, one thing this pattern picture buys us that the machinery picture never quite could, and it is worth the price of the whole detour. If a mind is a pattern, then the death of a mind is the destruction of a pattern. And the destruction of a pattern is a subject physics knows a great deal about. We have a whole science of how order falls into disorder, of how the intricate slumps into the bland, of how a thing that took great trouble to arrange comes apart on its own with no trouble at all. That science is thermodynamics. And its second great law is perhaps the most reliable statement we have ever made about the behavior of the world. It says, left to itself, order does not maintain itself. It leaks, it smears, it runs downhill into sameness. A sandcastle becomes a lump of sand. A drop of ink in a glass of water spreads until the whole glass is a pale, even gray, and never, not once in the history of the universe, gathers itself back into a drop. Now put a living brain against that law, and you see something almost defiant. A brain is a spectacularly ordered thing. All those precise connections, those exact concentrations of salt inside and outside each cell, that fine embroidery of structure that holds a lifetime of memory. Order like that should be running downhill every instant, and it is. The only reason it does not slump into gray is that the whole apparatus is fighting back, spending energy, bailing water out of the boat as fast as it comes in. Every heartbeat delivers the fuel that runs the pumps that hold the order in place against the endless downhill pull. The brain is not a still object. It is a waterfall standing upright, held against gravity by a constant expenditure of power. Stop the heart, and you stop the bailing. You do not, in that first instant, sink the boat. You simply stop keeping it dry. And then the second law, which was patient the whole time, which was always there, takes over the bookkeeping. The pumps fall silent. The careful differences in salt and charge that took a lifetime to maintain begin to even out on their own. The way warm and cold water in a bath find one lukewarm compromise if you leave them be. The ink begins to spread, and the pattern that was a person, the specific weave, the particular embroidery that no other brain in the history of the world ever exactly matched, begins, quietly and without malice, to smear toward the gray. This is why some careful thinkers have come to say that the true moment of death, the one that matters, is not the silent heart and not even the flat line on the tracing. Those are events in the story, but they can sometimes be undone. What cannot be undone is the smearing itself, past a certain point. There is a threshold somewhere in that slow spreading of the ink, a moment after which the pattern is so far gone that no power in the universe, no clever machine we could ever build, could read what was written there and put it back. Before that moment, in principle, the information is still on the page, however faint. After it, the page is blank, and it is blank forever. And that, this thermodynamic point of no return, may be a far better definition of death than anything a stethoscope ever gave us. Let me show you the man who first dared to write that definition down, and the strange laboratory that gave it its name. He was not a physician, this man. He spent his working years among codes and ciphers, in that odd and lovely trade where people think all day about how a message can be locked and scrambled and buried, and then, if you are clever enough and you hold the right key, unlocked again and read clean. That is what a cryptographer does, and a person who lives inside that trade comes to see the world in a peculiar way. To him a thing is not truly gone the moment you can no longer see it. It is gone only when the information that described it can never by any road be brought back. A letter burned to ash is not merely out of your sight. The pattern of ink that carried its meaning has been thrown into smoke and warmth and stirred through the air of the whole room, and no reader, however patient, could gather those particles back into sentences. To a man who thinks in codes, that scattering is the real death of the message, not the flame. The scattering. In the year 1992, this man, whose name was Ralph Merkel, took that habit of thought and turned it on purpose upon ourselves. He was writing about something that sounds at first like a curiosity, the freezing of bodies, the question of whether a person cooled down very far and stored very carefully might, in some distant year, be warmed and repaired and woken. Set aside whether you believe such a thing could ever work. What matters for us is that to ask the question honestly, Merkel first had to ask a deeper one. He had to ask what it would even mean for the attempt to be hopeless. When is a person truly, finally beyond return? And he answered it not with a heartbeat and not with a flat line, but with information. A person is dead, he said, in the way that actually counts, when their memories, their personality, their hopes, their dreams, everything that made them themselves have been destroyed in the information sense. He meant something very precise and rather merciless. He meant that the tiny structures in the brain that hold all of that, the exact arrangement of the connections, the particular pattern written across those 100 trillion junctions, have been disturbed so thoroughly that no procedure, no machine, no genius of any future century could ever read what remained and reconstruct the person who had been there. Not difficult, not expensive, impossible, in principle. He gave this a name, and the name is where our two threads finally braid together. He called it information death, and you can hear the cryptographer in every syllable of it. Notice what this quietly does to our whole investigation. We began at a crime scene with a stopped heart and a running clock. We watched the textbooks call the case closed at 4 minutes at 6 minutes. But Merkel's definition tells us that the heart was never the victim. The heart is only the machine that keeps the ink wet. The real victim is a pattern, and the real crime is the smearing of that pattern past the point of reading. And here is the part that ought to make you sit very still. Under this way of seeing, the moment of death is not an event you can point to on a monitor. It is a threshold buried somewhere in the slow chemistry of ruin, and on the near side of it the person is, in the deepest sense, still there, still written, however faint. Only on the far side is the page truly blank. So what pushes the ink across that line? Here the physicist can speak plainly, because it is the plainest physics there is. While you are alive, your brain is doing something almost outrageous. It is spending energy, hand over fist, every second, for one purpose above all others, to hold itself in a state that would never happen by accident. Every difference held across every membrane, every ion kept on the wrong side of a wall, every delicate gradient that lets a signal mean something, all of it is a kind of order that the universe does not give away for free. It has to be paid for, moment by moment, with fuel and oxygen, like a man on a ladder bailing a boat that leaks in 10,000 places at once. That constant bailing is what being alive, in the physical sense, largely is. When the heart stops, the man on the ladder climbs down. Nobody is bailing anymore. And now the second great law of thermodynamics, which had been held politely at bay your whole life, is finally let into the room, and it does the only thing it ever does. It levels. It mixes. It takes every careful difference and lets it slide towards sameness. The ions that were held apart come drifting together. The reactions that were kept in check run loose. The order that took a lifetime to build and a body's whole effort to defend begins, quietly and without any malice, to fall apart into warmth and randomness. This is not a picture I am dressing up for you. This rise of disorder, this increase of what we call entropy, spreading through the fine architecture of the brain, is the physical act of forgetting. It is the smearing of the ink, told in the honest language of heat. And that at last is what makes death irreversible. Not because some rule forbids the heart from beating again. We restart hearts. It is because the second law only ever points one way. You can watch a drop of cream stirred into coffee, and you will never, not once in the whole history of the world, see it gather itself back into a drop. The mixing is easy, and the unmixing is, for all practical purposes, impossible. And it is impossible for reasons of sheer overwhelming probability, which is the deepest kind of impossible that physics knows. When the pattern of a mind is stirred into the warmth of its own decay, that same one-way door swings shut behind it. That is why the true point of no return is thermodynamic. It is the moment the cream can no longer be found in the coffee. But hold on, because our case had one more strange fact in it, and it fits here with a click you can almost feel. Remember the surge. Remember that just before the fall, in those first seconds, the dying brain did not simply grow quieter. It flared. Its highest oscillations leapt to hundreds of times their ordinary strength. In the language we are now speaking, entropy first spikes. For a handful of seconds, the brain becomes, by one measure, more richly various, more full of possible arrangements than it may have been in ordinary waking life, a system briefly blazing through states it never normally visits, and only then does the whole thing collapse toward the flat and final sameness. A spike, and then the long fall to zero. It is as though the page, before it goes blank, throws every word it ever held into the air at once. And now we can test whether we truly believe any of this, because if death is really a thermodynamic event, a matter of order lost to warmth, then it ought to obey the plainest rule that warmth obeys. It ought to depend on temperature. Cold reactions run slow. And they do. There is a practice in the hospitals of chilling a body down to somewhere around 32 to 34 degrees Celsius, a handful of degrees below the ordinary warmth of a living person. And when you do this, something remarkable happens to the very clock we started with. The brain's hunger for oxygen drops. The whole ruinous cascade, the failing pumps, the flood of the wrong chemistry, the smearing of the ink, slows down as if someone had thickened the very fluid the reactions swim in. The window that was 4 minutes, 6 minutes, stretches wider. The threshold moves. You have, quite literally, bought time by lowering the temperature. Sit with what that means for our whole investigation, because it is not a small thing. It says the moment of death is not fixed like a mark cut into a wall. It is a rate. And a rate can be turned up or down with a dial we already know how to touch. Cool the ink and it smears more slowly. That is exactly, precisely what you would expect if consciousness and its dissolution are, at bottom, a matter of thermodynamics and nothing more exotic. The dying brain behaves like heat, because, in this telling, it is heat, order paid for, and then, when the paying stops, surrendered. So we seem to have our verdict, a pattern, held against the second law by ceaseless effort, flaring once as it falls, then smeared into warmth past a threshold that temperature itself can nudge. Clean. Complete. The cryptographer and the physicist shaking hands over a closed file, and yet I find I cannot quite sign it, and I do not think you can either, because a single word in Merkel's definition has been sitting in the corner this whole time, waiting, and it will not let me rest. The word is information. He said the person is gone when the information is destroyed. Destroyed. And of all the notions a physicist can hold in his hands, information is the one that has grown strangest in recent years. Because there is a serious and stubborn argument, coming not from the study of brains at all, but from the study of the most violent objects in the sky, that information may be the one thing in this whole universe that can never truly be destroyed at all. Now I want to be honest with you about what I am doing here, because it would be easy to slide from good physics into wishful thinking, and I have spent far too long despising that trick to play it on you now. Everything I have told you in this last stretch is solid. The second law is solid. The temperature dependence is measured in real wards on real nights. Merkel's definition is careful and sober, and it was written by a man with no reason to flatter you. But the thing I am about to reach for is different in kind. It lives at the far edge of what we understand, out where the equations begin to argue with one another, and I will mark that edge clearly as we cross it, so that you always know which ground is firm underfoot and which is still trembling. Here is the puzzle, stripped down to its bones. In everyday life, we throw information away constantly, or we believe we do. You burn the letter, you wipe the board, you stir the cream, and it certainly feels destroyed. But the physicist carries a quiet suspicion running underneath all of that, that the destruction is only ever a convenience of bookkeeping. That if you could somehow track every particle of smoke, every eddy of the coffee, every scrap of heat that carried the pattern away, the information would still be there, in principle, merely scrambled beyond any practical reading. Hidden, but not annihilated. Difficult past all hope, yes. Truly gone, perhaps never. And if that suspicion turns out to be right, then Merkel's word, destroyed, becomes a far subtler thing than it first appeared, and the blank page at the end of a life may not be quite as blank as the second law makes it look. Let me sharpen the difference, because everything downstream depends on getting it clean. When you stir the cream into the coffee, the pattern of the swirl gets carried off into the fine motions of countless little molecules, jostling, bouncing, sharing their nudges around until no eye and no instrument could ever pick the cream back out again. That is scrambling. The entropy has gone up, which is only a fancy way of saying the information has spread out so thin across so many tiny degrees of freedom that reading it back would take a godlike accountant and a machine larger than the room. But scrambling is not the same as erasing. In scrambling, the ledger still balances. Every push still came from a definite pull. Run the film backward in your imagination, follow each molecule with perfect care, and the swirl reassembles itself, the cream lifts out of the brown, the letter unburns. Nature, at her most fundamental level, seems to keep her books this way. She hides things with terrible thoroughness. She does not appear to throw them out. That single suspicion that the underlying laws only shuffle the deck and never lose a card has a proper name in physics. We say the microscopic laws are reversible. And it is not a soft, poetic wish. It is baked into the very form of the equations we trust the most. The little rules that govern how one moment of the world turns into the next moment, whether you write them the way the old mechanics did or the way the quantum bookkeepers do, all share this stubborn feature. Feed them a present and they hand you back exactly one past and exactly one future. No ambiguity, no fork, no card quietly slipped up the sleeve. If that is really how the world is built from the bottom, then the word destroyed, the word Merkel leaned on so heavily, starts to wobble. Because underneath our clumsy human sense of loss, there may be a level where nothing is ever truly lost at all. Only misplaced, catastrophically, and forever, as far as any living creature could care. So you see the shape of the tension now, and it is a beautiful one. On the one hand, we have the second law of thermodynamics marching in one direction, telling us the coffee cools, the letter burns to ash, the brain past the point of rescue slides into disorder and stays there. On the other hand, we have this quiet reversibility down in the foundations, whispering that the disorder is only apparent, that the pattern is still written somewhere in the fine grain, in the heat, in the scatter. And the physicist has learned to hold both of these at once without flinching, because they are answers to two different questions. One asks, can you in practice get it back? And the answer is no, never, forget it. The other asks, is it there in principle encoded in the total state of everything? And the answer we think is yes. The tragedy of the burned letter is real. It is just a tragedy of access, not a tragedy of existence. I want to take this idea to the one place in all of physics where it was pushed to the breaking point, because that is where you learn what a principle is really made of. Not in the coffee cup, where you can always mutter about practical difficulty and go about your day, but in the most violent eraser the universe has ever built. I mean, of course, the black hole. Here is an object so greedy with gravity that it swallows whatever falls in and shows you nothing but a smooth, dark surface and a little mass, a little spin, a little charge. Throw in the encyclopedia, throw in the diamond, throw in your grandmother's letters, and from the outside the whole looks the same as if you had thrown in an equal weight of dull gray dust. Everything that made those things particular, the arrangement, the pattern, the information, appears to vanish behind that surface as completely as anything has ever vanished anywhere. If there were a perfect grave for information, a place where the ledger finally does not balance, surely it would be here. And for a while it looked exactly that bad, because we learned that these holes are not truly black. They glow, ever so faintly, they leak, they shrink, and given enough of the deep patience of the cosmos, they evaporate away entirely into a dim haze of radiation. So now the terror sharpens to a fine point. The letters fell in, the hole that swallowed them slowly boils off into featureless warmth and then is simply gone. And if that warmth carries no trace, no hidden fingerprint of what went in, then here at last is real destruction, honest annihilation, the card burned rather than shuffled. This is not a small worry. If information can truly be destroyed in the belly of a black hole, then the reversibility I told you was baked into the foundations is a lie, and the whole careful ledger of the world has a hole torn in its bottom line. I am not going to pretend to you that this was settled with a handshake, because it was one of the great arguments, and men who understood gravity better than almost anyone stood on opposite sides of it and would not budge for years. But I want you to feel where the weight of physics ultimately came down, because it tells you something about how deeply we believe in that unbroken ledger. The instinct of most, in the end, was that the information could not simply be gone, that the faint radiation leaking out of the hole must, in some scrambled and monstrously encoded way, carry the fingerprints of everything that ever fell in, the way the drifting smoke carries, in principle, the burned letter. Not readable. Never readable, not by us, not in 100 lifetimes of the universe, but present. The book's balancing, after all, in an ink so fine no hand will ever trace it. That was the wager many were willing to make even against the fiercest object in creation, and it tells you how reluctant nature seems to be to ever truly throw a thing away. Now let me stand at the edge I promised to mark, and mark it plainly, because I am about to step from the firm rock onto the trembling ground, and I do not want you to mistake one for the other while you drift. Everything I just told you about scrambling versus erasing, about the reversible foundations, about the black hole and its stubborn ledger, that is firm rock, contested at the frontier, argued over, unfinished in its details, but firm in its bones. It is the honest working picture of how physicists think information behaves in this universe. What comes next is softer. It is the leap someone makes when they take that principle, that lovely idea that information is only ever hidden and never annihilated, and they carry it across the threshold of a dying human being and ask whether it might apply there too. That is not established physics. That is a hope wearing the clothes of physics, and you deserve to be told which is which. Here is the leap, laid out gently so you can turn it over as you fall asleep. If the pattern that is you, the memories and the temper and the particular way you love things, is written in the fine arrangement of your brain, then the second law, the honest, brutal one, says that arrangement scatters into heat and disorder once the fire of your metabolism goes out. And Merkel is right, and you are gone in the only sense that matters to anyone who has to live in the world. That is the sober reading, and I will not talk you out of it, because it may well be the whole and final truth. But the softer voice, the one that borrows the black hole's ledger, asks a stranger question. It asks whether the information, once scattered, is destroyed or merely hidden, whether the smoke of you, dispersed past all reading, is nonetheless still written into the total fine grain of the world, exactly as the burned letter is, exactly as the swallowed encyclopedia may yet be. And the quantum picture of consciousness we met earlier, the one with the little cylinders humming inside the neurons, takes that soft question and makes it softer still, and bolder, by suggesting that the relevant pattern is not merely thermal, but woven at some level into the fine geometry of space and time itself, so that when the cylinders lose their coherence at the end, the information does not so much burn as it disperses back into the deep fabric it came from. I say all of this to you with a very steady hand on the throttle, because it is easy here at the edge to let the engine run away with you. That last idea, the dispersal into the geometry of space-time, is speculation of the most delicate kind. It is a beautiful thought. It is consistent, at least, with the way physics loves to conserve rather than destroy. But consistency with a principle is not the same as evidence, and we have no instrument that has ever caught the pattern of a mind lingering in the fabric of anything after the brain that held it went dark. The rock beneath us here is the conservation of information, which is real and hard-won. The trembling ground is the claim that your particular information, the you of you, is conserved in any form that could ever again be assembled into an experience. Between those two lies a gap that no experiment I know of has crossed, and an honest lecture keeps its footing squarely on the near side of it while pointing, with open curiosity and no promises, at the far. Let me stay with that gap a little longer, because it is the most honest place in the whole investigation, and a good detective learns to be comfortable standing exactly where the evidence stops. There is a place in physics where the same gap appears, and appears in giants, and it may help to look at it. Because when a puzzle shows up twice in nature, in two rooms that seem to have nothing to do with each other, it is usually trying to tell you something. Think about a black hole. You take a book, a beautiful book, full of the particular arrangement of ink that makes it that book and no other, and you throw it past the horizon. It is gone. You cannot go get it. And for a long time the argument raged about whether the information in that book, the exact pattern of it, was destroyed forever, or whether it was somehow smeared onto the surface, preserved in a scrambled form you could in principle read if you were patient enough and clever enough and had a few eternities to spare. The people who worked hardest on this came, slowly and against their own first instincts, to a conviction that nature does not tear up the book. She scribbles in the margins, she scrambles the letters, she hides the pattern so thoroughly that no living creature could ever reassemble it. But the pattern, the raw information, is not erased from the accounts of the universe. That is a deep principle, and it did not come cheaply. Men spent careers on it. Now look what we are tempted to do with it at the deathbed. We hear that information is conserved, and the mind, being a pattern, wants to slide the two together and say, well then, the pattern that was me is conserved too, filed away somewhere, safe. And I understand the pull of that. But watch the sleight of hand, because it is the same one that trips up every eager student. Conserved is not the same as retrievable. Conserved is not the same as still being a mind. The letters of the book may all still exist, every one of them, scattered across the outgoing whisper of radiation, and the book is still, in every sense that a reader cares about, gone. So even if you grant the physicist his cherished principle in full, even if not one bit of what you were is ever truly deleted from the ledger of the cosmos, that buys you the survival of the letters, not the survival of the sentence. It is a colder comfort than it first sounds, and an honest one. Here is where a cryptographer walked into the room of all people and gave us the sharpest tool in the whole case. His name was Ralph Merkle, and in a paper written in 1992, thinking about whether a frozen brain could ever in principle be brought back, he coined a phrase that cuts right to the bone. He called it information theoretic death, and his definition is so clean I want to say it plainly, because it does more work than all the poetry. A person is dead, he said, in the information theoretic sense, when the structures that held their memories, their personality, their hopes, the whole private arrangement of them, have been so thoroughly disrupted that recovery is impossible. Not just for us, not just with our clumsy tools, but impossible in principle. Impossible for any technology that could ever exist, because there is simply nothing left to work from. The pattern is not hidden. The pattern is gone. See what that does. It quietly takes death away from the heart and hands it to the arrangement of matter in the skull. The stopping of the heart is a headline. It is loud, it is sudden, it is what everyone points to. But under Merkel's knife, the heart stopping is only the beginning of a process, and the real event, the true and irreversible one, is the slow erasure of the pattern that follows. And that erasure has a name in physics, and the name is entropy. While the blood was flowing and the sugar was burning, the brain was doing an extraordinary thing, a thing every living thing does and that we notice only when it stops. It was spending energy, constantly, ceaselessly, just to hold its own shape. Every one of those tiny pumps I described earlier, the ones bailing the boat, was fighting the natural tendency of things to spread out, to blur, to come to the same dull temperature and the same dull sameness. Life is a wall built against that blurring, and the mortar of the wall is energy, poured in without pause. The moment the heart stops, the pouring stops. And now the second law of thermodynamics, which has been held at bay your whole life by all that furious spending, simply walks in through the open door. It does not walk in violently. That is the thing to understand. It does not smash. It relaxes. The molecules that were held in that precise, improbable, meaningful arrangement begin to do what molecules always do when nobody is paying the bill. They wander. The delicate boundaries soften. The chemistry that was carefully steered now runs wherever it likes, downhill in every direction at once, and every one of those uncontrolled little reactions nudges the pattern a hair further from what it was, and a hair closer to a warm, uniform, meaningless mush. Entropy, which is really just a bookkeeping of how many ways the pieces could be arranged and still look the same, climbs and climbs. And the arrangements that spelled out you were rare, exquisitely rare. One particular whisper among an ocean of noise, so every step toward the average is a step away from the message. This is the thermodynamic cascade, and it, not the silent heart, is the executioner. The heart stopping only lets it in. Now, if you have been following me as a partner and not just a listener, a small light should be going on, because I have just told you something with a loose thread hanging off it. And a good investigator always pulls the loose thread. I said the erasure is driven by chemistry running wild, by reactions proceeding downhill without supervision. But chemistry has a well-known enemy: cold. Reactions slow down when you cool them. Everyone who has ever kept milk in the icebox knows this in their bones. So if death is truly a thermodynamic process, if it is entropy climbing through the tissue, then it should not be a fixed thing at all. It should have a dial on it. It should be slower when the brain is colder. And it is. This is not speculation, this is done in hospitals. Cool the body down gently to somewhere around 32 to 34 degrees Celsius, and the brain's hunger for oxygen drops away, and the window during which the tissue can survive without blood stretches open wider than anyone would have guessed. The cascade I described, the swelling, the flood, the storm, all of it is postponed. The clock that we started at the very beginning of this whole investigation, the one that seems so absolute, turns out to run on a slope you can tilt. Warm it runs fast, cold it runs slow. And a thing that has a temperature dial on it is not a metaphysical event. It is a physical one. Death, at least the death of the pattern, is behaving exactly the way a thermodynamic process ought to behave, which is the strongest hint we have yet stumbled on that consciousness, whatever else it is knitted into the same thermodynamics as a candle or a kettle or a river finding the sea. Hold that thought against the strange thing we found much earlier, the surge. Because there is a way of reading everything now that starts to hang together, and I want to lay it out slowly, the way you would lay out the last few cards face up before you say who did it. The measurements of the disorder in the brain, the entropy of its electrical chatter, tell a curious two-part story. In a mind that is awake and vivid, the entropy is high, there are enormously many patterns the network is dancing among, more ways to be, more richness. In deep unconsciousness it falls, the repertoire shrinks, the dance narrows. And at the edge of death the readings do something that no tidy theory ordered them to do. They spike, first. A last flaring of possibility, the network briefly lighting up with more configurations than it had any right to, and only then the long, final collapse into the flat and the uniform and the gone. That first spike, that flaring, may be the very gamma surge we chased through the rat lab and then through those 4 silent human beings. Not a mystery bolted on from outside, not a ghost, but the thermodynamic system giving one last, wild, disorderly gasp of complexity as the walls that constrained it fall away, the way a dammed river, in the instant the dam breaks, is briefly more alive with motion and pattern and turbulence than it ever was while quietly held. And there is a way to test that reading. A real one, offered by careful people who do not traffic in ghosts. If that surge is truly the machinery of vivid inner experience running hot, then the very same electrical signature ought to appear when you give a healthy brain one of those substances that are known to conjure the same kind of experience the dying report. Same fingerprint, 2 doors. If the fingerprint matches, we have caught something real about the physics of the last moment. If it does not, we have to think again. That is what a clue is supposed to do. It is supposed to tell you where to point the next instrument. Now sit for a moment with what that test really implies, because it is quietly enormous. It says the last moment is not a locked room. It has a handle on it. If a chemical given to a wakeful, healthy person can raise the very same storm of fast rhythm in the very same patch of tissue, then the dying surge stops being a spooky one-time event and becomes a repeatable condition of the machinery. Something you can summon, study, turn over in your hands. And notice what kind of investigator makes that move. Not the sort who wants a miracle, the sort who wants a knob to turn. Give me a dial, the neuroscientist says, and I will show you whether your ghost is a ghost or a state of matter. So let me hand you one more dial, and this one has been sitting in the hospitals the whole time, hiding in plain sight. Cool the body down. Just that. Bring a person from the ordinary warmth of the living down to somewhere around 32 to 34 degrees Celsius, a few degrees below normal, cold enough that the hands would feel alarming to the touch. And when you do this to someone whose heart has stopped, something almost unfair happens. The clock slows. The brain, chilled, sips at its oxygen instead of gulping, and that pitiless window we talked about, the 4 to 6 minutes past which the damage becomes a sentence, stretches. The neurons that would have crossed the line stay on the near side of it a little longer. Doctors have used this for years, deliberately, as a way of buying a dying brain more time to be saved. Stop and taste how strange that is. If the mind at its edge were a soul, a thing standing outside the physics, why on earth would a thermometer have any say in the matter? Why would lowering the temperature of a lump of tissue, the same way you lower the temperature of a chicken to keep it from spoiling, hold the door of consciousness open a few extra minutes? A soul should not care how warm the room is, but a thermodynamic process cares enormously. Chemistry is temperature. Slow the heat and you slow the reactions. All of them, the good and the ruinous alike. The fact that cold buys time is not a small clinical footnote. It is a fingerprint. It tells you that whatever consciousness is doing in those final minutes, it is riding on ordinary molecular traffic. And molecular traffic obeys the temperature the way everything else does. The dying mind is not exempt from the weather. It is made of it. And once you see it that way, once you accept that the mind is a pattern being held up out of the mess by a constant push of energy, you can ask a much sharper question than when does the heart stop? You can ask, when is the pattern truly gone? Those are not the same question, and a very clear-eyed thinker worked out some decades ago exactly how far apart they are. His name comes out of the world of codes and secrets, and he asked what it would mean for a person to be dead, not in the everyday sense, not in the paperwork sense, but in the deepest sense the physics allows. He called it information theoretic death, and the definition is austere and beautiful. A person is dead, he wrote, in the information theoretic sense, when their memories, their personality, their hopes, their dreams, everything that made them a particular someone have been destroyed so thoroughly that no process, not now, not with any conceivable future tool, not even in principle, could ever read them back out again. Sit with the phrase, not even in principle. That is a much higher bar than a flat line on a monitor. A flat eeg says the orchestra has stopped playing. It does not say the musicians are gone, or the instruments smashed, or the sheet music burned. Information theoretic death is the burning of the sheet music. It is the point at which the arrangement of matter that spelled out a person has been scrambled past all recovery, so that asking to bring them back is like asking to unmix milk from coffee by stirring the other way. And here is the thing the codebreaker saw that the doctors watching their monitors could miss. The moment the heart stops and the moment the sheet music burns are not the same moment. There is a gap between them. Time passes in that gap. And what fills that gap, what does the actual burning, is not a mystery at all. It is the plainest, most reliable law in all of physics. You know this law even if you have never named it. It is the one that says a dropped glass shatters, but the shards never leap back into a glass. It is the one that says heat flows from the hot coffee into the cool room and never the other way, that smoke spreads out through a still room and never gathers itself politely back into a thread. Left to itself, everything runs downhill from order into disorder, from the improbable and structured toward the probable and smeared out. Physicists have a word for the smear, for the count of how many ways the pieces could be arranged while looking equally messy, and the word is entropy. And the law, the second law, says that entropy in a system left to its own devices only ever climbs. Now here is why a living thing is such a scandal to this law, such a marvel. You are, right now, an exception held open by force. Your brain is one of the most exquisitely ordered arrangements of matter in the known universe. A lace of connections spelling out every face you love and every word you know, and the second law wants that lace unmade. It is leaning on it, always, the way water leans on a dam. The only reason you persist, the only reason the pattern stays a pattern, is that you are pouring energy in without pause. Every heartbeat carrying sugar and oxygen up to those cells so they can keep bailing, keep repairing, keep holding the disorder back one more second, and one more, and one more. Life is not a substance. Life is a refusal, a steady, stubborn pushing back against the smear. So now let the heart stop and see the whole thing plainly. The pumping ends. The energy stops arriving. The bailing stops. And the second law, which has been patient this entire time, which has been pressing on the dam every instant you are alive, finally gets its way. Nothing dramatic announces it. The reactions that were held in check simply let go. The molecular fences fall. And the exquisite lace begins, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart into the vastly more likely mush. That, and not the silent heart, is the death the codebreaker meant. The heart stopping is only the moment the guard leaves his post. The burning of the sheet music comes after, at the pace the chemistry sets, and it is the rising tide of entropy through the fine architecture of the brain, the very architecture that spells you, that does the erasing. And this is where our whole case snaps suddenly into a single frame, because look at what the entropy is doing on the way down if you watch it closely enough. People have watched. They have measured how disorderly the brain's electrical patterns are across all the conditions we know: wide awake, deep in dreamless sleep, sunk in a coma, thrashing in a seizure. And a lovely regularity falls out of the numbers. When you are richly conscious, when the inner theater is full, the brain runs at high entropy, meaning it is exploring an enormous range of possible configurations, never settling, always ready to be 1,000 different patterns in the next instant. When consciousness fades, that range narrows, the brain grows more predictable, more locked into a few dull states. Consciousness, by this reading, is not order and it is not chaos. It lives in the fertile country between them, in a system rich enough to hold vast variety, yet organized enough to hold it together. And what does such a system do in its final minute, as the energy that disciplined it withdraws and the second law takes hold? It does not fade politely to gray. First, for one strange interval, the variety spikes. The constraints that kept the brain marching in orderly step come loose, and for a few seconds the whole instrument can flare into more possible configurations at once than it managed in ordinary quiet waking, the dam breaking, the river briefly wilder than it ever was while penned. There is your gamma surge, standing in the record exactly where the thermodynamics says a burst of disorderly richness ought to stand. And then, because the energy is truly gone and nothing is bailing anymore, the whole space of possibilities collapses. The variety drains away toward nothing. The brain settles into the one flat, overwhelming likelihood, the smear, and stays there. Entropy spikes, and then entropy, in the only sense that matters for a mind, is finished. So we have followed the disorder all the way down, and it has told us a coherent story, a physicist's story, needing no ghost. But you will notice I have been speaking of richness and variety and the number of patterns as though I could simply count them, as though there were an honest bookkeeping of exactly how much of a mind is present at any instant. And that is a promise I have not yet made good on. To say "you," to say "phi," to say there is a real number, a single quantity, that rises as a mind fills with experience and falls as it empties, and that reaches zero at some precise and definable instant, is to make a claim so bold that a fair share of serious people have called it not physics at all. Before we can read the final line of the death certificate, we have to ask whether that number is real. Let me tell you what happens when you try to actually measure it. You take the theory at its word. It says a conscious system has a certain wealth of integrated information, and it hands you a recipe for computing that wealth. You look at the recipe, and you find that to compute it honestly for a real brain, with its billions of cells and its trillions of connections, you would have to consider every possible way of slicing the system into parts, and compare the whole against all of those slicings. And the number of ways to slice a system that large is a number so enormous that if you set every machine on Earth to the task and let them run until the sun burned out, you would not finish a rounding error of it. So the honest number for a real mind cannot be computed. Not because we are lazy and not because our machines are slow, but because the arithmetic itself outruns the universe. And a quantity you cannot compute even in principle, for the very object you built it to describe sits in a strange place. It may still be true, but it does not behave like the quantities a physicist is used to holding in his hand. And so, in the same year that the newest and most careful version of this theory was written down, a group of serious people, scholars who had spent their lives thinking about the brain, put their names to a letter, and in that letter they said a hard thing. They said this is not science at all. They used the word pseudoscience. They said the theory cannot be tested, cannot be cornered, cannot be forced to make a prediction that would prove it wrong, and that a theory which can never be wrong is not really telling you anything about the world. Now that is a heavy charge, and I want to be fair to both sides here, because this is exactly the kind of quarrel that teaches you something if you slow down and watch it instead of picking a team. The people who built the theory did not think they were writing poetry. They thought they were writing physics. They started from what it feels like to have an experience, from the plain fact that your experience is one thing, whole and unified, and yet also enormously detailed and specific, and they tried to turn those obvious features of a mind into mathematics. That is a respectable ambition. That is what you are supposed to do. And the people who signed the letter were not fools swatting at something they had not read. They were pointing at a real wound. If the central number cannot be measured and cannot even be estimated without smuggling in guesses, then when the theory tells you that this number falls to 0 at the moment of death, you have no way to walk up to a dying brain and check. You cannot lay the meter against the body. You are being asked to trust the story because the story is beautiful, and beauty, as I have said before and will keep saying, is a wonderful feeling and a terrible witness. So here we are, deep in our investigation, and one of our two grand theories of the mind, the quantum one, has been badly bruised by an experiment run under a mountain, and the other one, the information one, turns out to rest on a number that no one can actually put on a scale. You might feel, at this point, a little cheated. You came here to find out what happens to your awareness at the instant your heart stops, and I keep handing you theories that either fail the arithmetic or refuse to be measured. But do not be discouraged. This is what a real investigation feels like from the inside. It does not feel like a detective story in a book, where every clue clicks neatly into the next. It feels like standing in a cluttered room, holding two broken instruments and slowly realizing that the fact that they are both broken and broken in different ways is itself a clue about the shape of the thing you are chasing. Because notice what neither theory can explain away. Neither of them, whole or broken, told us to expect a surge. Nobody sat down beforehand with pencil and paper and predicted that a brain with no blood, no oxygen, no fuel, a brain that by every ordinary rule should be sliding quietly into silence, would instead throw up a blaze of its highest, most organized rhythms 392 times louder than the murmur of an ordinary waking thought, and throw it up precisely in the one patch of tissue that builds your sense of where you end and the world begins. The information theory says the mind should be draining towards 0. The quantum theory says the delicate coherence should already be gone in less time than it takes light to cross a single cell. And the brain, ignoring both, lights a bonfire on its way out the door. That is the thing we are actually trying to explain. That is the body in the library. Everything else is us fumbling with the suspects. Now, a careful mind will ask the obvious question, and I want to honor it. Could the bonfire just be the machinery breaking? When a great engine seizes, it does not die politely. It bucks, it shudders, it throws sparks. It makes a tremendous racket precisely because it is failing. Could the surge be nothing more than that? The last violent noise of a system tearing itself apart, no more meaningful than the scream of metal in a crash? That is a fair thought, and it might be right. But here is where one careful scientist, thinking about these very results, handed us something precious. He handed us a way to find out. He said, look, if these high rhythms at the edge of death really are the physical shadow of some vivid final experience, some sense of light or presence or motion, then we should be able to find the same fingerprint somewhere we can actually examine at our leisure. There are substances, certain compounds that alter the mind, that produce experiences people describe in almost the same words the dying use. Leaving the body, dissolving into something larger. A flood of meaning. If those experiences and the deathbed experience are truly cousins, then the living brain under those substances ought to show the same electrical signature, the same bright gamma chorus in the same region, and we can put a healthy volunteer in a quiet room and simply look. Do you see how lovely that is? That is a broken investigation healing itself. Instead of arguing forever about what a dying man might or might not have felt, which we can never ask him, we quietly move the whole question to a place where the witness can wake up afterward and tell us. If the fingerprints match, we have learned that the surge is not mere wreckage, that it carries the specific stamp of a certain kind of experience, and we can begin to study that experience honestly, in daylight, without anyone having to die. And if the fingerprints do not match, if the substance lights up the brain in a wholly different pattern, then we have learned something too. We have learned that the deathbed bonfire is its own creature, unlike anything in the ordinary catalogue of altered minds, and that would be, if anything, the more astonishing result. Either way we win, because either way we replace a rumor with a measurement. That is the whole trick of this business. You do not settle a mystery by deciding which story you prefer. You settle it by finding the one place where the world will consent to answer a yes or a no. And while that experiment waits to be done, let us not lose our grip on the ground we have already won, because we have won some. We know, with real confidence, the plumbing of the collapse. We know the fuel runs out in a matter of minutes. We know the little pumps that hold each cell in careful electrical tension fail, and the cells swell, and the careful separation of charges that a neuron spends its whole life maintaining comes undone in a great slackening wave that rolls across the surface of the brain. We know that after that wave passes, a flood of the very messenger the brain uses to think becomes a poison and begins to take the machinery apart. None of that is in dispute. None of that needs a ghost, or a quantum, or an unmeasurable number. That much is ordinary physics and ordinary chemistry, running downhill, exactly as the second law says things must run when you stop feeding them energy. The mystery is not whether the machine stops. The machine certainly stops. The mystery is the flare of order the machine throws out in the very act of stopping, an upward flick of richness at the top of the slide before the long fall into stillness. And that upward flick is where the deepest question of all is hiding, the one I have been circling this whole long night. The one I have not yet dared to state plainly, because if consciousness really is at bottom a pattern of information, a particular arrangement, an ordering, a structure written into the trembling matter of the brain, then when that structure comes apart, we are entitled to ask the physicist's most stubborn question about it. Not is it gone. Anyone can see it is gone. The question is whether the information that it was, the exact pattern, the precise arrangement that was you, is truly destroyed, wiped clean out of the world, or whether it is merely scattered, smeared into the heat and the jostle of the atoms, unreadable forever by any means we will ever possess, and yet, in some strict and almost cruel accounting, still there. Those are not the same thing. And which of the two actually happens is not a matter of comfort or preference. It is a matter of what the laws of physics permit. So let us ask them. There is an old instinct among the people who chase these laws for a living, and it is worth saying out loud gently, because it sits right at the sore center of everything I have been turning over tonight. The instinct is this: information, in the very deepest sense, is a remarkably hard thing to truly destroy. You can hide it. You can shuffle it until it looks like nonsense. You can smear it so thin across so many tiny pieces that no creature who ever lived could hope to gather it back into shape. But the bookkeeping of the world, down at its finest grain, seems to insist, quietly and stubbornly, that the ledger always balances. Think of a letter tossed into a fire. To you, to me, it is gone. The words are gone, the paper is gone, and you cannot read it, and you never will. Yet the smoke, the curl of ash, the warmed and trembling air above the flame, the particular way each little scrap of matter went flying off in its own direction, all of that, in principle, in the strictest and most unforgiving accounting we can imagine, still carries the faint fingerprint of what the letter once was. Run the whole picture backward, molecule by molecule, every collision reversed, and the letter climbs back out of the fire and lies flat and readable on the table again. That is the instinct. Nothing is ever really erased from the universe. It is only, sometimes, made unreadable forever. Now hold that thought against the strangest object the equations have ever coughed up, because this is exactly where the physicists went to war with themselves over precisely this question. Throw a book, or a chair, or a whole star into a black hole, and it falls in and is gone. And for a long while some very clever people argued that its information was not merely hidden, but genuinely destroyed, wiped clean out of existence, scrubbed from the ledger in a way nothing else in physics is ever allowed to be. And other very clever people said, no, that cannot be right, because if it were right, then the whole careful architecture of the laws we trust starts to wobble and crack. The pattern must still be there, they said, scrambled beyond all hope of reading, smeared into the surface and the slow leak of the thing, but there. And whichever side you find yourself leaning toward, notice the shape of the disagreement, because it is exactly, precisely, uncannily the shape of the question standing over the deathbed. Is the pattern destroyed, or is it only scattered? Wiped, or merely hidden? These are not the same, and the difference between them is not a matter of feeling. It is a matter of what the laws will and will not allow. So we drag that grand cosmic quarrel down out of the sky and set it beside a single human skull. When the heart stops, and the structure that was a person begins to come undone, which of the two things is happening? Is the arrangement that was you being torn out of the world root and branch, or is it merely being shuffled into the heat and the jostle of the warm wet matter until no one ever by any means could read it back? And I want to be honest with you in the calm middle of this long night, because a lesser talk would blur the two together and let you drift off comforted. They are not the same, and yet, for you, for the person you love, for the practical, aching, human meaning of the word gone, they may amount to exactly the same thing. And there is a man who saw this with a cold and beautiful clarity and gave it a name. His name is Ralph Merkel, and he was thinking, back in the early 1990s, about a very strange and specific question, and along the way he handed us something far larger than he set out to. He asked, what does it actually mean to be dead? Not the heart, not the breath, not the flat green line on the machine. What is the deep, final, physics-grade definition of death? The one that no clever future doctor could ever argue their way around. And his answer is what he called information theoretic death. A person, he wrote, is dead according to the information theoretic criterion if their memories, their personality, their hopes, their dreams, everything that made them the particular pattern they were, have been destroyed in the information theoretic sense. Destroyed so thoroughly that recovery is impossible, not just for us, not just for our clumsy tools, but impossible in principle, impossible for anyone, ever, with any conceivable machine, because there is simply nothing coherent left to recover. Notice what a high and terrible bar that is. Your heart can stop, and you are not yet dead by this definition, not if the pattern still stands. The letter has not yet gone into the fire. It is only lying there, unread, waiting. And that, precisely that, is why those doctors chilling a body down toward 32, 33, 34 degrees Celsius can sometimes reach back across what looked like the border and pull someone home. The pattern was intact. The book was still on the shelf. No one had struck the match. But the match does get struck. And here is where the gentlest and most relentless law in all of physics steps quietly into the room and does the thing it always does. While you are alive, your brain is a furious little furnace, burning fuel every second, spending energy without pause to hold its own delicate order against the constant pull toward disorder. It is like a sandcastle that is somehow rebuilding its own walls, grain by grain, faster than the tide can wash them down. That is what living is. It is the ceaseless, expensive, magnificent work of holding a pattern still against the current. And the instant the heart stops, the fuel stops arriving. The little furnace goes cold, and with nothing left to pay the bill, the second law of thermodynamics, which had been held politely at bay your whole life long, simply, patiently, takes what it is owed. The uncontrolled reactions begin. The exquisite microarchitecture, the fantastically specific arrangement of molecules that spelled out every memory you ever kept and every face you ever loved, starts to slide, irreversibly, toward the bland and featureless sameness that the law always demands in the end. The entropy climbs and does not come back down. And this, not the silent heart, not the flat line, this slow thermodynamic dismantling of the very substrate that held the pattern, this is what the deep definition calls true death. The heart stopping is only the moment the bill comes due. The dying is the settling of the account. And there is something almost unbearably poignant buried in the numbers here, something the machines have actually watched. When they measured the entropy of the living brain, the sheer richness of it, the number of different arrangements the network could flicker between from one instant to the next, they found something you might not expect. The waking, conscious, aware brain is the high entropy one. It is the busy one, the one holding the most possibilities open at once, the one dancing between the greatest number of configurations. Deep sleep is lower, coma is lower still. Consciousness, it seems, is not order and quiet. It is a controlled, sustained, gorgeous kind of richness, a wide-open sky of possibility held aloft by constant effort. And so watch, now, what the dying brain does, with everything we have gathered laid out before us. As the end arrives, the entropy does not simply fade politely towards zero. First it spikes. It flares. It leaps upward in that last paradoxical surge, that flood of high-frequency fire we chased across the rat lab and the 4 silent human beds, that roar of activity in a brain that is supposed to be going dark. As though the sandcastle, in the very moment the tide finally reaches it, throws every last grain it has into the air at once. And then, only then, after that final flare, the whole structure lets go and the entropy collapses and does not rise again. The order that was holding the pattern up dissolves back into the warm, anonymous jostle of ordinary matter. So set the 2 answers side by side honestly, the way a fair detective lays out the last of the evidence before naming anything. On the one hand, the physicist's old instinct whispers that the information is never truly gone, only scattered, smeared into the heat and the motion of 10 to the 20-something restless atoms, in principle still there, still summed in some cosmic ledger that never ever loses a single entry. Run the film backward, atom by perfect atom, and there you are again. On the other hand, the man who thought hardest about death itself tells us that scattered past all reading is the only kind of gone that has ever mattered to a human being, and that once the second law has done its slow work through the fine grain of the brain, the pattern is destroyed in the only sense we will ever be able to touch. Both of these can be true at the very same time. The ledger balances, and you are still gone. The information is conserved, and it is also, for you and everyone who will ever miss you, utterly and finally lost. And I have been circling that strange double answer all night, because I do not think it is a contradiction at all. I think it is the deepest and quietest thing the laws have to tell us about this. But there is one more turn to take before I would dare to say what it means. One last place with the smearing and the scattering points somewhere I have not yet let myself look, and I want to walk out onto that ledge slowly, and carefully, and together.